The dust of Odell, Texas tasted like endings. A woman stood alone on a sunburned street. One trunk. A dress that had been cream-colored when she left Missouri. No husband waiting. No money left. Nothing except the way she squared her shoulders when the whole town stopped to watch her fail. 2 miles west, the largest ranch in 3 counties held a horse no man could break. Black as midnight. Dangerous as gunpowder. And a man who hadn't spoken about the thing that broke him in 2 years. She saw the horse and said, "He's not mean, he's terrified." The man turned around. Something shifted. In the yard. In the air. In the locked room inside him that had been dark so long he'd forgotten there was a door. But there was a man who had spent 12 years watching and waiting for exactly the wrong moment to strike. The dust of Odell, Texas tasted like endings. Not the soft kind, the gritty back-of-the-throat kind that coats everything it touches and refuses to wash out. Mae Sutton knew that taste before the stagecoach even stopped rolling. She'd been swallowing it for 3 days solid, all the way from St. Louis through the flat nothing of eastern Texas, down into this gouge of a town that the railroad had passed over and apparently God had too. She stepped down without waiting for the driver's hand, because waiting felt too much like hoping, and hoping had gotten her here in the first place. Her trunk landed in the dust with a thud that echoed off the clapboard storefronts like a door slamming shut. One trunk. That was the whole of Mae Sutton at 28 years old. One trunk, a dress that had been cream-colored when she left Missouri, and was now the color of a tired apology, and a stack of letters tied with string that she had not read since crossing the Red River, because reading them made her chest hurt in a way she couldn't afford right now. The letters were from Earl Cobb. Earl Cobb, who had written her 7 times over 4 months in penmanship that slanted slightly left, who had described his farm in careful, earnest terms, who had mentioned the sunsets over his back pasture twice, who had promised her a home, not a grand one. The word had been enough. Mae had grown up in a house that was 4 different addresses in 12 years, following her father Thomas Sutton from horse fair to horse fair across Kansas and Oklahoma, sleeping tick-in-tack rooms and boarding houses, and once memorably in the back of a wagon while a blizzard sealed them in for 2 days outside Wichita. Home had always been a thing other people had. Earl Cobb had offered her the possibility of it, and she had sold the last of what her father left her, his pocket watch, silver-cased, engraved with initials she'd memorized from rubbing them with her thumb to buy the ticket to come claim it. Except Earl Cobb was dead. Reverend Whitmore was already walking toward her from the direction of the small whitewashed church, and she knew from the way he moved that particular forward lean of a man bracing against the weight of bad news that something was wrong before he opened his mouth. He wore a black vest over a white collarless shirt, his hat held in both hands in front of him like an offering. "Miss Sutton." He said her name like a question he already knew the answer to. Mae kept her eyes level. "It's to be Mrs. Cobb." "I have come a long way to be Mrs. Cobb, yes." He stopped 3 feet from her, looked at his hat brim. "I'm afraid that's what I need to speak with you about." Earl Cobb took a fever. 7 weeks passed. We buried him on the ridge behind his property. The world did not tilt. Mae had expected it to tilt, had braced for the lurch of it, but it didn't come. Instead, everything went very still and very specific. She could see the grain in the wood of the nearest storefront. She could see a curtain moving behind the window of the building across the street. She could feel the sun on the back of her neck and the dust settling on the toe of her left boot. She had nothing. She was nowhere. And every person on this street had already decided what her story was. The curtain moved again. Someone watching. Letting her be watched. She didn't look toward the window. She squared her shoulders instead, and met Reverend Whitmore's eyes with the steadiness she had learned from watching her father, face down, a spooked horse, the stillness that was not calm exactly, but control, something underneath panic that held its shape. "I see," Mae said, just those 2 words. Clean and closed. Reverend Whitmore's face fell further into itself. He offered her 3 nights on a cot in the back room of the church, meals with him and his wife, and all of it wrapped in the particular silence of people who meant well and could not imagine what came next for a woman in her position. What came next for a woman in her position? Mae had been asking herself that question since before she finished her first meal in Odell, sitting at the Whitmores' small kitchen table with a bowl of beans she couldn't taste and a window that looked out on the back of a fence. The answer had to be practical. She had perhaps $4 left in the bottom of her trunk, folded into the hem of a second dress. Not enough to get back east. Not that there was anything east worth going back to. She needed work. The kind that came with a roof and a wage. 3 days of looking. The dressmaker's shop on Main Street was owned, she learned, by a woman named Mrs. Pickford, stout iron-haired lips arranged in a permanent judgment that she wore like a second collar. Mrs. Pickford looked at Mae's hands on the morning of the first day, turned them over with 2 fingers, and said she was full up. She was not full up. The sign in her window said otherwise. But the sign in her window had been there before Mae arrived in Odell, and so it did not count as a lie exactly. Just a refusal dressed in better clothes. The restaurant wouldn't take her. "We have a girl," the cook said, and that was the end of it. The feed store had work, but the owner's wife had opinions. "This isn't really the kind of situation where we can," and the door closed before she finished the sentence. Mae walked back to the church each evening with grit in her teeth and a list of closed doors growing in the back of her mind. She did not cry. Crying accomplished nothing she couldn't accomplish better by thinking. She had learned that early. Watching her father trade horses sentiment was a liability in negotiation, and right now she was negotiating for her own survival. On the morning of the 4th day, she heard something useful. Roy Briggs was 22, lean as a fence rail, with a face that hadn't quite settled into what it was going to be yet but was trying hard. He sat on the steps of the saloon in his flannel shirt blue-gray cotton, faded at the collar, and spoke to another hand about ranch work, the way young men in frontier towns always spoke about ranch work, with the ease of people who didn't know what it cost. Mae walked past and heard him say the name. Granger. The Granger spread, Roy was saying, out west of town. 3,000 acres at least, maybe more. Best cattle operation in 3 counties. Holt Granger ran it tight and ran it hard. And yeah, he was a rough one to work for, but he paid fair and he didn't much care where you came from so long as you could do the job without him having to say so twice. Mae stopped. She kept her back to Roy Briggs and the other man. She listened for another 10 seconds to be certain she had it right. Holt Granger. Largest ranch in the territory. Foreman who did the hiring. A man who, according to Roy Briggs, didn't ask unnecessary questions. She had never been to a ranch asking for work in her life. She had worked in stables, cared for horses from the time she could reach a halter, trained 2 Greenbroke mares for a farmer outside Lawrence when she was barely old enough to do it alone. But she had done those things in the context of her father's world, where she was Thomas Sutton's daughter, and that name meant something in horse circles along the Chisholm corridor. Here she was nobody. Here she was the mail-order bride nobody had claimed. Here she would have to walk up to a foreman's face and ask for work before he decided the story about her was more interesting than anything she could offer. She walked back to the church, told Reverend Whitmore she would be heading out in the morning, thanked his wife for the beans and the blanket, and spent the rest of that evening pressing her calico skirt against the bunk with her hands, because she had no iron, and she intended to arrive at the Granger Ranch, looking like a woman who had made a decision, not one who had been pushed into a corner. The walk was 2 miles. Her boots had been resoled once already and were working on needing it again. The morning was clear and the kind of warm that promised to become punishing by noon, and the road to the Granger spread was a wagon track cut through scrub grass and mesquite that occasionally disappeared into itself and had to be found again by triangulating against the tree line. Mae walked it straight through without slowing. She had been walking difficult ground since childhood. This was just ground. She smelled the ranch before she saw it: horse sweat, hay, smoke from a cookhouse fire, the faint mineral bite of a water trough in the sun. Then the fence line appeared, and the gate and the long low roof line of the main house, set back from the outbuildings, and the spread of it was larger than she'd imagined. Not a farm. A kingdom. The kind of place built by someone who intended it to last past their own lifetime. Clem Darvish was at the gate. She knew before she reached him that this was going to be the first wall. He had foreman written in every angle of his posture, arms crossed under the chest, weight back on his heels, a careful economy of movement that said he had made this particular assessment before and could make it quickly. Flannel shirt, dark stripe pattern, suspenders tooled from good leather pulled tight over the shoulders, hat pushed back far enough that she could read his face without difficulty, which was not a face that intended to be helpful. He didn't wait for her to get fully to the gate. "We're not hiring." Mae kept moving forward at the same pace. Not aggressive, just not stopping. We're especially not hiring strays. He spat a stream of tobacco juice to the right of her path. Not at her feet, just near enough. She stopped 3 feet from him, met his eyes, opened her mouth to speak, and then something behind him erupted. It started as shouting, 3 or 4 voices pitching upward at once, one of them very young, one of them cutting over the others. Then the sound of wood giving way under force, a sharp concussive crack that cut through the morning air like a rifle report, followed by something heavier and more sustained. Mae looked past Clem Darvish's shoulder. In the breaking corral beyond the main barn, a horse was coming apart. Black, entirely black, the kind of black that swallows light rather than reflecting it. 17 hands if he was an inch, all of it muscle and motion and fury, his body a single sustained act of refusing. He had already thrown one rider. She could see the man sitting in the dust by the fence, trying to get his bearings, and was in the process of making it clear to everyone else in the corral that their presence was a mistake. His hooves cut the air in a motion too fast to follow. The men at the fence rails scrambled. One vaulted clean over. Another pressed himself flat against the post as the horse wheeled past within 3 feet of him. Mae was watching the horse's eyes, not his hooves, not the line of his neck or the angle of his hindquarters, or anything that a person evaluating a dangerous animal would normally watch. His eyes, and his ears pinned hard back, not in aggression, in something older than aggression. His nostrils flaring at air already full of shouting men and the smell of his own sweat and fear. The ropes they'd been using to work him were still swinging from the fence where they'd dropped them, and the horse's gaze tracked them every time they moved, every single time, with the fixed, terrible attention of something that had learned ropes meant pain. He was not fighting them. He was trying not to die. A man separated from the others along the fence line, and the noise around him seemed to settle slightly, not because it actually quieted, but because he moved through it with such complete indifference to the chaos, that the chaos reorganized itself around him. He was enormous. Not merely tall, built on a different scale entirely. The way certain things in nature are built on a different scale, and you only understand it when you're standing next to them. 6'4" at least, broad through the chest and shoulder, in a way that made the corral fence he stood beside look undersized. Dark flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms despite the growing heat, vest of worn brown leather, canvas trousers tucked into umber boots that had seen 10,000 miles of this kind of ground. His hat was off, and in his left hand wide-brimmed brown felt, battered into a specific shape by long use, in his face without it was harder than she'd expected. Jaw squared and shadowed. Skin tanned to the same color as the Texas landscape around him. Eyes the color of a storm that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. Holt Granger looked at the horse. His voice when he spoke was low enough that Mae shouldn't have been able to hear it from where she stood. She heard it anyway. It cut through the noise the way cold water cuts through heat. Leave him. The men at the fence went still. Even the horse for just a half-second stopped moving. Mae took a step forward. She did it without thinking about it first, which was how she made most of the decisions that actually mattered. Her mouth was open before she'd fully committed to the idea of speaking. He's not mean. It came out flat and clear into the sudden partial quiet, like a stone dropped on stone. Clem Darvish turned around so fast she could hear the gravel move under his boot. His expression said a great many things, none of which she was interested in. Holt Granger turned slower. He turned the way very large things turn, with the deliberateness of something that doesn't need to hurry to be formidable. And he looked at her. It was the kind of look that took an inventory, precise and unhurried and faintly incredulous, not because she was a woman, though that was presumably part of it, but because she had spoken with the conviction of someone who knew what she was talking about. And the thing she was talking about was currently trying to destroy his corral. His gaze moved from her face to the horse and back to her face in the time it took the horse to execute one full circle of the corral. Clem made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a laugh. "Lady, that horse would put you in the ground before you finished the sentence." Mae did not look at Clem. She looked at Holt Granger and she said, "You're fighting him. Every man in that corral is fighting him. He doesn't know what you want him to do. He only knows that everything in this space is trying to force him into submission, and his body is telling him that's how prey dies. He thinks he's already dying. No animal fights like that unless it believes its own life is ending." Silence. The horse wheeled along the far fence. 3 men watched it with their hands on the rails. Holt Granger watched Mae Sutton. He had a very specific quality of stillness, the kind that wasn't passive, the kind that was making a decision. The muscle in his jaws moved once. He looked at Clem Darvish and he said 4 words. Give her the bunkhouse. Not let's hear her out. Not she might have a point. Not find out who she is first. Just the conclusion, arrived at in the span of 30 seconds, and spoken with the finality of a man who had reached conclusions this way his whole life and had stopped second-guessing them. Clem's face did the thing faces do when they understand what has just been taken from them. The change was small and quick and ugly. He looked at Mae with something that went past resentment into a territory that had its own weather. Don't know what game you're running, he said, low enough that only she could hear. But you won't last the week. Mae didn't answer him. She followed his directions to the bunkhouse old, a separate cabin from the main structure, smelling of lye soap and old wood, and the particular staleness of a space that hadn't held a regular occupant in a while, and she sat down on the edge of the narrow bunk and put her hands on her knees and let herself breathe for the first time since the stagecoach had stopped. She had a roof, not a home, not yet, but a roof, presumably, a wage of some kind, and work that she could actually do. The rest of it she would figure out as it came. She did not let herself think about the look in Holt Granger's eyes, the way it had landed on her, not the weight of it, not the strangeness of being seen by someone who clearly saw very little, because that way was a kind of distraction she could not afford in a place where she already had too many enemies and no allies at all. Pearl ran the cookhouse. She was the first person in Odell, or anywhere adjacent to it, who spoke to Mae without either pity or calculation, and she did it while stirring a pot big enough to bathe in, without looking up. You eat with the hands. End of the table. Don't take more than your share and don't be late. Then a pause. You know horses. It wasn't a question. My father traded them, Mae said. Kansas, mostly. Some Oklahoma work. Pearl turned to look at her then. Took her measure in the way older women do. Quick and thorough and unlikely to be wrong. Pearl Avery, she said. Turned back to her pot. That was the whole introduction. It was enough. The work Clem assigned her for the first week was not stable work. Laundry first, and not light laundry, but the full hard water scrubbing of 20 men's worth of flannel shirts and canvas trousers and wool socks, in tubs that required hauling and heating and more physical effort per hour than anything Mae had done, since helping her father pull a mired wagon out of a creek outside Enid. Her hands were red by noon on the first day. By the third day they had calluses on top of calluses, and she stopped thinking about them entirely and just worked. She ate alone at the end of the long trestle table in the cookhouse. The hands watched her with the specific curiosity of men who had heard the story, and they had all heard the story. Clem had made sure of that and weren't sure yet whether the story was the whole truth. Most of them kept their distance. 2 of them were outright unfriendly in the deliberate way that meant they had received instructions. One of them, a weathered man of maybe 50, with a gray beard and steady eyes named Hector Webb, nodded at her on the 3rd morning when she came in. Just a nod. She nodded back. It was more than anyone else had offered. The evenings were hers. After the work was done and the cookhouse cleaned, and the rest of the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, Mae walked out to the corral where Obsidian was kept, and she stood 20 yards from the fence and she talked to him. Not sweet talk. Not coaxing. Just talk. The way you talk to something that is in pain and afraid and has no frame of reference for why people keep approaching it with ropes and loud voices and the smell of their own adrenaline on their skin. She told him about a mare named Clover she had known as a girl, a bay quarter horse with a Roman nose and the disposition of a patient schoolteacher, who had been the first creature she'd ever spent real time with that wasn't moving on to the next place by the end of the week. She told him about the theory her father had worked from, that the fastest way to ruin a horse's spirit was to win a fight with it too early, before it had decided whether or not it trusted the person asking. That trust wasn't a thing you demanded. It was a thing you made space for. The first night he ignored her entirely, paced the fence line with his head low and his ears flat. The second night he stopped pacing and stood at the far end of the corral with one ear rotated toward her, just slightly, as if her voice was a radio signal he was having trouble picking up clearly. The third night he stood still for 7 minutes. She counted. Holt Granger watched her from the window of his study. He did not do this because he was interested in her specifically. He did it because Obsidian was $2,000 of prime breeding stock, who had already injured 2 of his men, and who he had begun to suspect might be unworkable. And if an itinerant woman with no known references and a story that didn't fully add up had some effect on the animal, he needed to know what it was and why. This was what he told himself. He was not a man who spent time analyzing his own reasoning, but he told himself this clearly enough that it functioned as the explanation for a while. What he saw across 3 evenings of watching from that window was a woman who made no demands, who asked for nothing, who stood in the early dark of a Texas evening in a calico skirt and a worn coat and talked to an animal worth more than her entire life's material history, as though they were for 2 sensible parties in a reasonable conversation. And the animal, the 1,600-pound engine of pure unresolved panic, stood still for it. Night by night, a little stiller. The windows of the study were good glass, set in during the 2nd year after he'd built the main house properly, and they gave a clear view of the corral and the western pasture, and on clear nights, the shelf of stars that piled up above the flat horizon. He'd spent a lot of evenings at this window in the past 2 years, not looking at anything in particular, or looking at everything in the particular way of someone who has learned that the outside of a place is safer than the inside of their own thoughts. Ruth had loved this window. She had stood at it on mornings with her coffee, and watched the light change on the grass, and she had sometimes narrated what she saw in the lazy, specific way she narrated everything she loved. The way the dew caught on the fence wire, the way the quarter horses moved down toward the water trough in the same order every morning, as if they'd agreed on protocol. She had a gift for attending to things. It was the thing about her he had never been able to adequately describe to anyone who asked, and he had stopped trying after the 1st year. She had died in April. 2 years passed this coming spring. Her horse, a gray roan named Silver Creek, 17 years old and as predictable as a clock, had spooked at a rattlesnake on the South Pasture Road and gone down on his side and rolled, and the weight of him had ended her before anyone could reach them. There was no logic to it. Holt had spent considerable time in the months after trying to find the logic in it, and discovering there was none, which was worse than if there had been. He had shot Silver Creek himself, there in the South Pasture with the spring light still on the grass, and he had not been on a horse he cared about since. Obsidian had been purchased 6 months later, at a livestock auction in San Antonio, as what he privately understood to be a piece of misdirected fury. The horse was impossible. The horse would stay impossible. But at least the horse was something he could be angry at, without it feeling like a betrayal of something he had loved. He turned from the window on the 3rd evening, and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass he did not drink, and sat down at his desk with the ranch ledgers open in front of him, and looked at numbers without reading them for the better part of an hour. The new woman was a complication, that was all. What she was not, he told himself, was a solution to anything. She hadn't been on the Granger spread a week when the trouble with the mare happened, and the trouble with the mare was how the rest of the hands began to take her measure. One of the working mares was in foal and past her time, and the foal had turned wrong in the night. By the time anyone caught it in the morning, the mare was in genuine distress down on her side in the stall, sides heaving, getting up and going down again, her flanks dark with sweat. Clem took one look and said what he always said in situations that required either patience or skill, that it was a lost cause. Fetch the knife, put her out of it. It was the tone that did it. That specific efficiency with which some men dressed their own limitations as pragmatism. Mae was in the barn that morning helping with the feeding. She heard it. She set down the pail she was carrying and she walked to the stall without asking permission. Because asking permission, she had come to understand in the past several days, was not a language Clem Darvish responded to with anything except new ways to say no. Leave. She said it to Clem directly, and it came out with the calm precision of someone who has made a calculation and found the answer clean. Clem's whole face pulled in one direction. She was very aware of the shift in air in the barn, as the 2 or 3 hands who were present went carefully still, the way witnesses go still. She was also aware that she had approximately 30 seconds before the window closed. She was already kneeling in the straw by the mare. Her hands found the foal's position by touch, the way her father had taught her, slow and deliberate, and communicating through her palms that there was no alarm here, only information. She talked to the mare the whole time, low and continuous and steady. The mare shuddered but didn't fight her. 22 minutes. The foal came out into the straw small and wet and immediately trying to determine what its legs were for. which was the most optimistic thing Mae had seen in Texas. She sat back on her heels, the calico skirt ruined past saving, her forearms wet to the elbow, and she looked at the men standing around the stall entrance, 4 of them now, drawn by the sounds of it, and she did not say anything. She didn't need to. The foal was the argument. The foal was staggering around in the straw figuring out physics, and that was the whole of the case. Hector Webb was one of the 4. He looked at the foal and then at Mae and then at the foal again, and he pulled at the gray edge of his beard and he said nothing. But later she would understand that this was when he decided. Clem stood at the back of the gathered men with an expression she committed to memory. Not embarrassment. Something harder than embarrassment. Something that already knew what it was going to do about this. He just hadn't decided when. That evening she went to Obsidian as usual. He was waiting for her. She understood this only in retrospect, that he had been pacing the fence line in his usual confined fury, until he heard her footstep on the path, and then he had stopped. She saw him stopped and still from 20 yards out, one ear cocked toward her before she'd made a sound loud enough for a human to hear, and something in her chest turned over quietly. She began to talk. She told him about the mare and the foal. She told him about the barn and the men watching. She told him about her father's explanation of why horses sometimes needed to hear a human voice the way humans sometimes needed to hear music, not for information, just for the presence of something that meant no harm. She felt eyes on her back. Not Clem's eyes. She had learned the temperature of his attention. This was different. This was someone watching from stillness rather than from irritation, and the stillness had weight behind it. She did not turn around. Holt Granger stood at the corner of the main barn for 11 minutes and watched Mae Sutton talk a $2,000 horse into something approaching peace. He stood with his arms not crossed but at his sides, which was not his usual posture, and he watched the horse's ears and the set of the horse's neck and the slow incremental lowering of the horse's head as the woman's voice ran on in the twilight. He stepped out of the shadow. She heard him. He could see it in the small adjustment of her shoulders. But she finished her sentence before she turned, which told him something. He walked to the fence and put one hand on the top rail, the fence that Obsidian had been using as a boundary in a territorial negotiation, and he stood there, aware for the first time in longer than he could account for, that he was standing next to someone in the early dark, and it did not feel like an intrusion on his solitude. It felt like the opposite of an intrusion, which was a thing he had no immediate category for and was therefore determined not to examine. "Your father was a horse trader," he said. Not a question. He had asked Pearl about the new woman's background because information was useful, and because he didn't ask people directly for things he could find out sideways. "Kansas, mostly," Mae said. "He taught me that a horse that won't be calmed by a human voice generally just hasn't heard a voice without something wanted behind it." Holt considered this. "That horse has thrown 4 men. I know. 2 of them weren't green. Webb's been working horses for 30 years. I know that too." She looked at Obsidian, who was watching Holt with the ears-back wariness of an animal that has learned which humans mean activity. He's not wrong about people. He's right about every person who's come at him so far. He just needs to be wrong about one. Holt said nothing for a moment. The night sky had fully committed to dark, and the stars were doing what Texas stars did, which was exist in such quantity that they seemed extravagant. "What's your name, Mae Sutton?" "I know your name." I mean, he stopped. He seemed faintly irritated with himself. "Who are you before this?" She told him the short version. The father, the horses, the years of moving, the letters from Earl Cobb, the pocket watch sold for passage money. She did not tell it with self-pity. She told it the way a person reports, "Geography, here was the terrain, here was where I traveled, here is where I am now." He listened without interrupting and without the particular flinching sympathy she had come to dread in Odell. When she finished, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, more like a space that hadn't decided yet what it was for. "The laundry is not the right work for you," Holt said. It was not an apology. He was not a man who dealt in apologies. She would learn. He stated facts and adjusted to them. "I'll speak to Clem." He walked back to the main house. She heard his boots on the dirt path, the weight of them, the unhurried pace of a man who owned the ground he walked on in the literal as well as figurative sense. She turned back to Obsidian, who had watched Holt go with the wary attention of a creature reassessing the immediate threat level of its environment. The horse took 2 steps toward the fence. Not toward her, just toward the fence. closing the distance by 3 feet of his own volition. For the first time since he'd come to the Granger spread, Mae stood very still. She did not speak. She did not reach out. She let the distance be what it was, which was smaller than it had been yesterday. In the window of the study, the lamp was lit, and she could see the shape of a very large man at a desk that looked too small for him, bent over what she supposed were ledgers. He did not look up. She wasn't looking for him to. She walked back to her cabin in the dark, and she sat on the bunk, and she thought about what remained of her money, roughly $3 folded in the dress hem, and about the foal learning to stand in the straw, and about the way Holt Granger had said the word who, when he asked who she was, like it was a different question from the one people usually meant by it. She thought about the pocket watch, the feel of it in her palm through 4 states of travel. Her father's initials pressed smooth into silver by 40 years of his thumb rubbing the same spot. The weight of it in a pawnbroker's hand in St. Louis, weighed against a ticket that was now used up entirely. Thomas Sutton had believed that a horse's trust was the most precise measurement of a person's character. You couldn't fake it. The horse either came to you of its own will or it didn't come. You could force compliance, but you could not force trust. And a horse could tell the difference not because it was smart in the way people were smart, but because it had been prey for longer than civilization had been measuring time. And it had developed the kind of perception that survival refines over generations. She thought, this ranch, this particular corner of Texas, this impossible horse, and the man at the undersized desk who had listened to her without flinching, and then asked who she was. She thought, careful, Mae. Then she lay down on the narrow bunk in the old bunkhouse that smelled of lye soap and the wood's long memory of other people, and she listened to the night sounds of the Granger spread the horses in the pasture, the creak of the main house, the specific silence that follows when a large place has settled into sleep, and she did not sleep herself for a long time, but she did not leave. Word count 4,102 wait, she would stay. She had decided it somewhere between the mare and the foal and the man at the window and the horse that had moved 3 feet closer on its own. And the decision had the particular solidity of decisions made not in heat but in the cold, clear country that comes after everything else has been felt and set aside. She would stay and she would work and she would earn whatever came next by the ordinary method of doing each day better than the last. Outside, the Texas dark was wide and without apology. Tomorrow Clem Darvish would make his displeasure felt in small ways that were legal and deniable. She already knew this and had already decided it did not matter. The ranch had horses that needed working and she could work them, and that was a kind of arithmetic that eventually simplified itself regardless of who was doing the counting. She closed her eyes. She thought of Obsidian taking those 2 steps. She thought, one thing at a time. And the night outside the window of the old bunkhouse ran on into morning. The mare survived. The foal survived. And by the end of that first week, the hands had stopped pretending they weren't watching Mae Sutton work. Not openly. Not with any acknowledgement that would require them to revise the story. Clem Darvish had been building since her 2nd day on the property, but the watching had changed quality. It had gone from the watching of men assessing a novelty to the watching of men reassessing a judgment, which were entirely different things and produced entirely different silences when she walked through the barn. Clem noticed. Of course he noticed. A man who had held authority through the management of other men's opinions for 12 years noticed the precise moment those opinions began to shift. He said nothing directly. He was too experienced for that. Instead, he assigned Mae the worst of the laundry rotation for 3 consecutive days after the folding the heavy wool blankets that had to be hauled wet and wrung by hand, work that left her arms shaking by noon. And he did it with the administrative innocence of a man simply allocating labor. His flannel striped shirt tucked neat, his suspenders straight, his face carrying nothing that could be named or challenged. Mae did the blankets. She did them without complaint and without the performance of stoicism that would have invited his attention. She simply worked. Because the work was not the point, and Clem's satisfaction in assigning it was not the point, and the only point that mattered was what she was building on this ranch one day at a time, and blankets were not going to stop that. What stopped her? Briefly, on the 4th morning was Obsidian. She had been avoiding the direct approach since her first evening on the property, not avoiding him, but giving him the room that his particular history required. She knew the shape of his damage without being told the specifics. You learn to read the shape of damage in horses the same way you learn to read weather. Not from a single sign, but from the aggregate of small things. The way a horse held its hindquarters when strangers moved behind it, the quality of its attention when ropes appeared, the specific frequency of its fear. Obsidian's damage had been built by force applied before trust existed. The prescription was time and the absence of demand. So she had given him that, standing at 20 yards in the evening, and talking to him the way her father had talked to difficult horses, not to communicate, exactly, but to establish that a human voice did not always precede something bad. On the fourth morning, coming back from the laundry tubs with her arms still aching, she passed the corral and Obsidian was at the near fence. Not pacing, standing. His ears were up, and his head was over the top rail by 6 inches, and he was watching her approach with the fixed attention of an animal that had made a decision about her direction, and was waiting to see if she would confirm it. She stopped 8 feet from the fence. Not the 20 yards of her evening position. 8 feet because he had moved the distance, and that movement was information she had to respect by meeting it. She stood still. Let him look. Let him run his assessment at whatever speed his nervous system required, which was not her speed and never would be. He dropped his head 6 inches. Not submission, recalibration. He was deciding whether the reduced distance was acceptable to him, whether the morning context and the morning smell of her and the fact that she had stopped and was not advancing further added up to something he could tolerate. They stayed like that for 4 minutes. Then he lifted his head again and turned and walked to the center of the corral, which was Obsidian's way of saying, noted, and I'm done for now, and this is not a defeat for either of us. She understood this, and she walked on toward the cookhouse, and she thought about her father saying that the first real conversation you had with a difficult horse was almost always the one neither of you initiated. Pearl had coffee waiting. Pearl always had coffee waiting, but this morning she had also set out a plate of the cornbread from the previous night's supper, which was Pearl's specific vocabulary. For you did something worth feeding properly. Mae ate it standing at the cookhouse counter, and felt the ache in her arms subside by increments as the morning coffee worked through her. Holt came through the cookhouse on his way to the south pasture, and stopped when he saw her. He stopped in the way of a man who has encountered something that requires a brief pause in his momentum. Not because the something is unexpected, but because it merits a moment of actual attention. He looked at the cornbread plate, looked at Mae's arms, which even rolled down in her flannel work dress, showed the particular tension of recent heavy labor in the set of the shoulder. He said, "Clem has you on blankets." "Yes. That's not your work." She met his eyes. "I know what my work is." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went out the back door toward the pasture, and 2 hours later Clem received a direction that Mae was not privy to, but whose effect was that the blanket rotation went back to the schedule it had been on before she arrived, and nobody mentioned it. That was the first time she understood that Holt Granger's attention, when it landed on something, did not evaporate when he walked away from it. The colic came on a Tuesday. Mae was in the barn working on the roan gelding's left hind. The thrush treatment was into its 2nd week, and the improvement was visible. The horse putting weight down with increasing confidence when she heard the change in Obsidian's corral. Not dramatic sound, just wrong sound. The absence of the usual rhythm of his movement, replaced by something heavier and more effortful. She left the roan and went to the corral gate, and she saw him and she knew immediately. Down on his side, rolling in the incomplete agonized way of a horse in gastrointestinal crisis, his flanks dark with the sweat that came from sustained internal pain. His legs moved without coordination, the signals from his nervous system crossed by the body's alarm. His eyes, when they caught the light, showed too much white. She was through the gate before she consciously decided to enter. Behind her she heard Clem arrive. She knew his footfall by now, the particular weight distribution of a man who carried his authority in his chest, and she heard him make the assessment she had been afraid he would make. Swift, certain, delivered with the efficiency of someone who had been through this before and knew the arithmetic of it. Lost cause. Better to end it now. Get the rifle. She turned to face him across the prone horse. "Don't send for anything yet." Clem's eyes went flat. "That horse is in serious colic. I've seen this before." "So have I." She held his gaze without aggression, just the specific steadiness of a person who has already made their calculation and is not interested in redoing it. "Give me 20 minutes before you decide." He looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man deciding whether the cost of this particular argument was worth what it might reveal about the state of his authority. Then he stepped back from the gate, with the body language of a man conceding a procedural point, while reserving the larger verdict. She went to her knees beside the horse and put both hands on his barrel. Pressed. Felt the distension hard round wrong, a gas accumulation. Possibly a partial displacement of the large colon, the kind that sometimes resolved with movement before it became the kind that didn't resolve at all. She had seen her father handle 3 cases. She had handled one herself, a gelding belonging to a farmer outside Wichita, 2 years before she came to Texas. That horse had lived, this one could too. Holt arrived from the direction of the main house. He came through the corral gate, and the quality of the space changed the way it always changed when he entered it, not because he demanded attention, but because he was built on a scale that registered without announcement. The sheer physical fact of him reorganizing the geometry of whatever room or yard or corral he occupied. He looked at the horse. He looked at Mae. He looked at Clem. Clem said, "I recommend we put him down. It's gone too far." Holt looked at Mae. She said, "It hasn't. But I need to get him on his feet, and I need peppermint from along the creek and chamomile from Pearl's stores. And I need these men out of this corral because their noise is adding to his distress." Silence. The particular silence of a question being asked without words, whose authority governs this space, whose read of this situation do we trust? What is the cost of being wrong in either direction? Holt looked at his horse. And here was the thing Mae had not expected. She saw the thing underneath his face. Not well hidden, not performed, but the actual thing, the flinch of a man who had stood over a horse he loved and made a final decision about it, and who carried that decision in his body the way some men carried old injuries, as a physical fact rather than a memory. He had called for a rifle before, and he had used it, and it had not made the grief smaller. It had only made it over. His jaw tightened. His hands at his sides closed into fists and then opened. Garrett. He addressed the youngest hand without looking away from the horse. "Creek. Fast as you can." He looked at the others. "Out." He looked at Clem last, and whatever was in that look, Clem received it and stepped out of the corral without another word. Then Holt looked at Mae. "What do you need from me?" Not, "What do you need?" "What do you need from me?" The distinction landed with full weight. He was not asking whether she needed anything. He was asking for his specific assignment in a plan he had already decided to trust. She told him, "Hold the horse's head when they got him up. Keep him moving regardless of his resistance to it. Match her pace without accelerating it." She spoke quickly and without apology for the directness of it, because directness was what the situation required, and Holt Granger was not a man who needed softening. Getting Obsidian to his feet took 35 minutes and required everything. He fought the attempt at first not aggressively, but with the dead resistance of a body in serious pain, the weight of 1,700 pounds that did not want to be moved. Holt was on the horse's head, his big hands on the halter, talking in the voice Mae had heard him use once before, low and without inflection, the voice underneath his regular voice, the one that had not been built for public use. She took the hindquarters, coaxing movement into legs that had forgotten what they were for. Between them, across the horizontal bulk of the horse, they worked in the call and response of people who had not rehearsed this but were discovering that they did not need to. Obsidian gained his feet, stood swaying. Holt kept his hands on the halter, and Mae went immediately to the near side and began walking, and the horse followed the way sick animals sometimes followed when the alternative was falling again. They walked. Pearl brought the herbal preparation in a heavy tin pail when Garrett returned from the creek. Peppermint and chamomile, steep dark and cooled just below scalding, the smell of it cutting through the barn dust and horse sweat in a way that was almost medicinal by scent alone. Mae introduced it slowly, the way her father had shown her, not presenting the bucket but dipping her fingers and letting the horse smell from her hand before she offered more. Obsidian, exhausted and dull-eyed, took it, once, then again. Then he dropped his nose into the pail and drank. The afternoon went. They walked in slow circuits around the corral, Mae on one side, Holt on the other, the horse between them. The sun tracked its arc and the shadows of the fence posts moved, and the rest of the ranch conducted its business beyond the fence rails, and several of the hands found reasons to be near the corral, without appearing to watch, which was the frontier equivalent of a vigil. Holt talked to her while they walked. Not about the horse, at least. Not only about the horse. He talked about his father's first winter on this land, a killing winter that had taken 2/3 of the cattle and one of the horses, and had not taken his father, because his father had the specific constitutional stubbornness of a man who had decided the land owed him something and intended to stay until he collected. He talked about the second barn he'd built, which was better than the first, because the first had burned in a lightning strike, and the second one he'd built knowing what fire could do. He talked about drought years, and how they changed a man's relationship to rain, how you stopped taking water for granted in any form after your wells had gone dry, and your cattle had walked themselves to death looking for what wasn't there. She listened, and she walked, and she understood that he was doing something deliberate, not filling silence for the sake of it, but offering her the history of the place in the way a man offered a thing he valued to someone he was deciding whether to trust with it. Each story was a small transfer. Each one required her to receive it without making it into more than it was, and she did this, responding when response was called for, and staying quiet when quiet was the appropriate thing, and she could feel him noting her accuracy with the same attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. She said, between circuits watching Obsidian's movement for the change she was waiting for, "My father used to say that land was just dirt until someone decided to love it. Then it became something that could break your heart." Holt was quiet for a moment. He was right. He was right about most things involving the ground and horses. She paused. He was less reliable about the human variety. Most men are. She looked across the horse at him. He was looking at the far fence, the brim of his hat cutting the late afternoon light into a long shadow across his face. She thought, this man has been alone in this place with his grief for 2 years, and it has made him more himself rather than less, which was not the usual outcome of that particular combination of factors. She thought, careful, Mae. And then Obsidian exhaled. It was the sound she had been listening for 4 hours, the full-body release of a system returning from crisis to baseline. Not a small breath, but the whole animal letting go of something it had been holding at cost. He slowed his walk without stopping. His head dropped to a normal carry position. The rigidity across his top line, which had been there since she'd first entered the corral, dissolved like something melting. Mae stopped. Holt stopped. They stood in the last of the afternoon light on opposite sides of a horse that was going to live, and looked at each other across his back. Holt's face in that moment was not composed, not the controlled surface he maintained as a professional disposition. Something had moved through it during the past 4 hours, not broken exactly, but loosened, the way ground loosens after long rain. He looked at her with the full, unguarded attention of a man who has just watched someone do a thing that cost them real effort for something that mattered to him, and who is reckoning with what that means. He said, "You could have let Clem handle it." "No, I couldn't. You'd have been within your standing to step back. It wasn't your horse." She looked at Obsidian's neck, dark with dried sweat, and then at Holt. "It's not about whose horse it is." He held her eyes for a moment that stretched past comfort into something more honest. "No," he said. "I suppose it's not." The rifle was still leaning against the fence post where Garrett had set it down when Holt had waved him off with it. Neither of them looked at it directly, but they both knew it was there. The work Mae's hands had done was logged in Holt Granger's account, in the specific way of things witnessed rather than reported. He did not tell her this. He didn't need to. The following morning her duties changed. No laundry, no kitchen assignment, nothing that was not stable work, and this change arrived without ceremony or announcement, the way his decisions arrived, as accomplished facts rather than proposals. The hands came to her with their horses, one at a time, then in a steadier stream, the way any resource found its users once its utility became known. Hector Webb's horse with the abscess she drained in 15 minutes. A young gray mare that had developed a fear response to the cinch from some previous rough handling. A bay gelding with a cracked hoof wall that needed careful trimming and a specific packing before it worsened. She fixed each one. She did not perform the fixing. She simply did it with the same focused economy she brought to everything. Assess the actual problem rather than the presented problem. Address the root rather than the symptom. Communicate through her hands what words would only complicate. The horses responded, and the men who owned the horses watched the responses and revised their positions on Mae Sutton with the quiet efficiency of people who respected demonstrated competence above all other arguments. Clem watched from various distances. He was not a stupid man. He understood exactly what was happening, and he understood that the mechanism of it was beyond his direct interference. He could not instruct the horses to stop responding to her, could not prevent the hands from bringing their problems to the person who solved them. What he could do was work the information he had in the spaces she couldn't see. And he began to do this with the patience of a man who had a long game and knew it. Mae knew he was doing something. She could feel the shape of it in peripheral evidence conversations that stopped a beat too quickly when she came near. A specific quality of Garrett's avoidance that had the texture of instruction rather than personal discomfort. She filed the intelligence and watched for its resolution. There was nothing else useful to do about it yet. On a Thursday evening, 12 days into her stable assignment, she came back from the creek, where she had been checking the downstream fence line at Holt's request, and she found Holt himself at the round pen fence, not observing, waiting. The distinction was in his posture, not the crossed arms watchfulness of supervision, but the open stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere specific and is there on purpose. She stopped beside him at the fence rail. The round pen was empty at this hour. The chestnut filly returned to the pasture after the afternoon's work. They stood looking at the empty space, and Mae understood, from the angle of his body and the deliberateness of his presence, that he had come to the fence to say something. She waited. "I owe you a conversation," he said without preamble. "About what you're doing with the horses and what I intend it to become." She turned to look at him. He was watching the round pen still, giving her the profile of his face rather than the full face, which she recognized as his way of saying something direct while managing its exposure. "You have more skill with horses than any person I've employed. More than Clem. More, I suspect, than anyone I could find inside 3 counties. He paused. "I want to formalize that. Stable manager. Not assistant, not helper. Manager. With authority to make decisions about the horses without routing them through Clem." She was quiet for a moment. Not because she needed to consider the offer, the answer was immediate and obvious, but because she was reading what surrounded the offer. The context of it. The fact that he had come here deliberately, that he had framed it in terms of authority and not merely function, that he had said it plainly rather than routing it through Pearl or through a change in daily assignments. "That will create a problem with Clem," she said. "I know. He won't accept it quietly. I don't require him to accept it quietly." His voice was level. "I require him to work within it." She looked at the round pen. "All right." He turned to look at her then, fully, and the evening light was the long horizontal kind that came in October gold and low and specific, the kind that made everything it touched look like it was being seen clearly for the first time. His eyes in that light were the color she had first noted, the stormy gray that had never quite settled into a stable register, and she understood looking at them now that the instability was not uncertainty but range. This was a man with more weather inside him than he ever displayed, and the display was a choice rather than a limitation. She held his gaze without looking away and without adding anything to the moment that the moment didn't already contain. He said, "My wife worked horses. Not Ruth worked horses. Not a name, not a reference point she was expected to navigate around. Just the fact, stated without the careful framing she had noticed him using when the subject approached from any direction. Pearl told me," Mae said. "I hope you know I'm not trying to. I know what you're not trying to do." He said it without sharpness, just certainty. "That's why I'm telling you." She waited. She would have been impatient with how long it's taken the roan gelding to get proper treatment. His mouth moved in something adjacent to a wry expression, brief and real. She had opinions about deferred maintenance on horses. She sounds like she was right. She was right about most things. He looked at the fence rail. "I haven't talked about her to anyone except Pearl since she died. Pearl doesn't count because Pearl already knew everything worth knowing before I said it." The thing in his voice when he said, this was not grief exactly. Grief had a specific texture she recognized from her father's last year, the raw, open quality of a wound that hadn't closed. This was something further along that process. The scar tissue of it, strong and permanent, and changed in composition from the original. "I'm telling you because you're going to be here, and I'd rather you knew than didn't." She thought about what it had cost him to say that. She thought about 2 years of not saying it to anyone except a woman who already knew. She thought about the rifle against the fence post that afternoon, and the thing she had seen move through his face when Obsidian exhaled. She said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded once, pushed off the fence rail. Then he stopped. not quite turning back but angling toward her enough to deliver one more thing. "There's a package on your cabin table. From the dry goods in town." He walked back toward the main house without elaborating. She found the package in the late evening light when she returned to the cabin for the night. Brown paper. Twine. The rough-hewn table they'd never bothered to replace with anything better, the surface scored and stained by years of use. She opened it with hands that were steady, because she had decided before she touched the paper that whatever it was, she would receive it without making it into performance. Blue calico. Deep true blue, the color of the sky at the specific hour before full dark when the dome of it went saturated and honest. 2 yards of it, solid and substantial, the weight of cloth meant to last. Beside it a length of brown flannel, the same warm brown as the coat she wore every evening. The coat that was thinning at both elbows in the way of something used faithfully past its optimal life. No card. No note. No explanation. She sat on the edge of the bunk with the calico across her lap, and she ran her thumb along the selvage, and she thought about 45 minutes. She thought about a man holding bolts of cloth up to a window in a dry goods store to see the colors in natural light. She thought about him identifying the exact worn brown of her coat from memory and matching it. She thought, "He noticed before I knew he was looking," which was either the most frightening thing she had learned about Holt Granger, or the most important, and she was not yet sure those were different categories. She put the calico on the table and picked up her needle and threaded it, and began the first seam of the dress by lamplight, and the sound of the ranch at night ran around the cabin, horses settling, wind in the dry grass, the far creak of the main house, and she worked without hurrying, the small movements of her hands making something out of the material a man had chosen, because he had been paying attention to her when she didn't know it. Outside, late enough that the bunkhouse had gone dark, Obsidian made a sound from his corral. One low call, not distress, just the sound of an animal taking inventory of the dark and finding it acceptable. Mae heard it and knew it was him by its specific register, the way she had learned all the horses on the property by their individual voices. She tied off her thread and held the lamp up to look at the first seam. Straight and clean. The blue of the fabric in the lamplight was different from the blue in daylight, deeper, richer, the color of something that had made up its mind. She thought about the Saturday supper Holt had mentioned 3 days ago, 1 week away. She thought about Pearl's pressed linen and the pewter candlesticks and the table that was too long for one person. She thought about Holt saying she would have been impatient about the roan gelding, and the brief wry expression that had crossed his face when he said it, real and unplanned. The kind of expression that arrived when the careful surface was briefly outpaced by something underneath. She set down the dress, turned down the lamp, lay in the dark and listened to the ranch breathe around her. Clem Darvish's window in the bunkhouse across the yard had gone dark an hour before hers. But she had noticed, on her way back from the creek earlier that evening, that he had ridden into Odell in the afternoon and turned with nothing, no supplies, no post, nothing that accounted for the trip. His face when he returned had the specific arrangement of a man who has had a conversation he found useful. She filed this and did not reach a conclusion yet, because conclusions required more information, and she had learned from her father that the most expensive mistakes were the ones made from insufficient data dressed up as certainty. She would watch. She would work. She would attend Saturday supper in a blue calico dress she had made from cloth chosen by a man who had noticed the color of her worn coat. And she would watch Clem Darvish with the peripheral attention of someone who understood that the most dangerous things on open ground were rarely the ones that announced themselves. The lamp went out. The dark settled. The dress lay folded on the table, the first panel cut, the first seam finished, the rest of it waiting for the next evening's work. Outside, the Texas night ran on toward morning without apology or consolation, which was the only way it knew how to run. And in Mae Sutton's experience that had always been exactly enough. The Saturday supper happened, and then another one. And then it stopped being Saturday supper specifically, and became something else that had no name yet, which was both better and more dangerous than a named thing. Pearl set the table in the main house dining room, with the particular ceremony of a woman who understood that the occasion mattered without anyone telling her it did. The room was not grand. Holt Granger had not built his house for grandeur, he had built it for permanence, and there was a difference that showed in every beam and joint and window frame. The table was long enough for a family that had never fully occupied it, scarred across the surface with years of use, set each Saturday with the same pressed linen cloth and the same heavy pewter candlesticks that Pearl maintained in a condition that suggested she had opinions about the alternative. The food was good. Honest frontier food, nothing pretentious, but made with a kind of care that had nothing to do with necessity, and everything to do with Pearl's private conviction that feeding people well was a moral position. Holt sat at one end of the table. Mae sat where Pearl directed her, which was not at the other end, as a guest might sit, but partway down the side, close enough for conversation without the theatrical distance of formality. Pearl ate in the kitchen. This was her stated preference and probably also her way of giving the room to what it needed. The first Saturday was careful, formal without being cold. They talked about the fillies, about the south pasture fence line that Roy had reported needed restringing, about a cattle auction coming up in Abilene in 6 weeks. Safe subjects, practical ones. The language of the ranch as a buffer between the actual conversation that neither of them was having. The second Saturday was less careful. Not careless, just less defended. Holt spoke about his father, who had broken the first ground on the Granger spread in 1851 with 2 horses, a mule, and the specific brand of stubbornness that frontier land seemed to select for. He described the original house 4 walls, and a dirt floor and a fireplace that drew badly and smoked out the single room through every winter of the first 3 years. The way his father had built each addition when he could afford it, not before, which meant the house grew in increments that reflected exactly what the land had given up in any given year. Good years, a new room, glass in a window. Poor years, just the maintenance of what already stood. Mae listened the way she had learned to listen, completely and without performing it. She asked questions that were specific rather than social, the kind that meant she had heard rather than just waited. Holt answered them fully, which was not his usual economy, and he seemed to recognize this as it was happening without being unsettled by it, which was itself a change from the man who had walked away from their first conversation at the fence with the deliberateness of someone removing themselves from something they'd decided to risk no further. She told him about Kansas. Not the version she'd given him the first night at the fence that had been geography. This was more. The specific quality of the light in August over the wheat flats. Her father's voice in the dark of a strange tack room, telling her the names of the stars through the gap in the boards because she was 7 and afraid of new places, and he knew no other cure for it. The mare named Clover, who had been the first consistent thing in her life, and what it had cost her when her father traded Clover for a better deal in a lean year. Not because he was callous, but because they needed to eat and horses were the currency of their world. Holt was quiet for a while after that. Then he sounds like a man who made hard decisions without enjoying them. He was exactly that. That's rarer than it sounds. She looked at him. He was looking at the candle between them, which had burned down a full inch in the course of the meal. You make those decisions, she said. I try to. He turned the pewter candlestick slightly, adjusting its position by a 1/4 inch, a small unconscious act of order. I don't always get it right. She didn't tell him he was wrong, because he wasn't wrong, and he would know it immediately if she offered false comfort, and they had already established without negotiating it that this was a space where the inaccurate thing was simply not said, which was its own kind of gift, rare enough that she was aware of it every time she sat at that table. What Clem Darvish was doing, meanwhile, happened at a frequency, and in locations that Mae was not always positioned to observe, but she felt it. The way water in a tank feels the slow lowering of the level through what it finds when it reaches for what should be there. The hands she had built rapport with began to hedge their approach to her. Not all of them. Not dramatically. But Garrett, who had been gradually warming from frozen courtesy towards something closer to ease, stopped bringing his questions to her first and started checking over his shoulder before he did. One of the hands from the east bunkhouse, a quiet man named Cole, who had once asked her to look at his horse's hooves and seemed satisfied with what she showed him now, walked past the barn with his eyes ahead. She noticed. She catalogued it. She didn't react to it in front of anyone, because reacting to it would give it more mass than it deserved. Roy Briggs found her at the round pen fence one afternoon in the 3rd week of her stable assignment, standing with his forearms on the top rail and his faded flannel shirt rolled to the elbow, watching the second gray filly work the perimeter with the new ease of an animal that had decided the pen was not a threat. You know what Clem's saying. Not a question. I can infer. She kept her eyes on the filly. He's been to town twice this week. Roy pulled at the rail's weathered grain with one thumbnail. Mrs. Pickford's involved now. And Reverend Whitmore, maybe. I don't know what exactly. I just know he goes in and comes back with that look. The look of a man who has found an audience willing to hear him. What is he saying? Still watching the filly. Roy was quiet for a half-second, which meant the answer was specific and he was deciding how to deliver it. That you came here with a plan. That the horse, the colic, the mare, that all of it was staged or timed in a way that was too convenient. That you knew Holt Granger was a rich widower before you ever set foot in Odell, and the whole mail-order business was a cover. A pause. He's also found out about Ruth. About how she worked horses. He's using that. Mae turned this over. The architecture of it was actually competent, which she gave Clem credit for in the privacy of her own assessment. It used the things that were true: her skill, her presence, Holt's vulnerability, and arranged them in an order that inverted their meaning. Skill became calculation. Presence became strategy. Holt's grief became the exploit rather than the thing she had been careful not to exploit. Does Holt know he's in town spreading this? I don't know. Roy met her eyes for the first time in the conversation. He was 22 with a face still in the process of deciding what it was, but his eyes were steady and older than the rest of him. What I know is that Clem's been here 12 years, and there are still 3 men in that bunkhouse who'd follow him off a cliff because he taught them how to rope, and those men hear things and repeat them without thinking about what repeating them means. She appreciated his honesty the way she appreciated clear weather practically, as useful information about conditions she had to navigate. Thank you, Roy. He pushed off the fence rail. I just thought you should know what you were up against. I already knew. She turned back to the filly, but it's useful to know the shape of it. He walked back toward the barn in his worn flannel and his faded hat, and she stood alone at the round pen fence, and she let herself feel, for just a moment, the specific exhaustion of being a woman in a place where everything she was good at could be reframed as suspicious by a person determined to make it so. Then she picked up the lead rope and went in to work the filly, because the filly needed working, and Clem Darvish's interpretation of her character was not going to unsaddle itself. The storm came on a Wednesday, which the clouds did not announce clearly enough until it was too late to do much about the timing. It came from the northwest, the clouds banking up in the afternoon sky, with the speed that Texas storms achieved when they meant business, the kind of purple dark that was less the absence of light than the presence of something heavier than air. The barometric drop was sudden enough that Mae felt it in the horses before she saw the full extent of the build. The working mounts in the pasture began moving in tight circles. Obsidian, in his corral, started the fence line pacing he'd abandoned weeks ago, not because of her, but because his body was reading the air with instruments a human body did not have. Holt came out of the main house at a run for the first time she had seen him move at speed. He was in his flannel and vest, hat pulled low against the first gusts, and he covered the distance from the porch to the pasture gate in a stride that was longer than she expected from even a man of his size, because urgency added something to it. She was already at the pasture gate. They worked without discussion, which was the most efficient way to work, and also, she noted in the compressed clarity that physical urgency produced, the way they had been operating for weeks anyway. The horses knew something was coming, and they communicated this through the particular contagion of herd anxiety one spooked, and the speed of the anxiety traveled through the group in seconds. Mae cut the working mounts into groups of 3 and moved them toward the barn in a wide arc, keeping herself between them and the fence line, which was where they wanted to bolt. Holt handled the 2 heaviest mares, who were the most likely to injure someone inadvertently in their distress. He did this with the easy, unhurried authority of a man who had grown up with animals large enough to destroy him, and had made a quiet peace with that possibility 30 years ago. No wasted motion, no unnecessary force. The mares went where he directed them, because he directed them with the confidence of someone who did not consider the alternative. The sky committed fully to its intentions around the time they had the last of the working mounts under cover. The wind hit the full force of itself in the space of 30 seconds, going from gusting to sustained in the way of a held breath suddenly released, the grass in the open pasture bending flat, the cottonwood near the corral fence throwing its branches sideways. Lightning. A split second of white. Then the crack that followed, enormous and simultaneous in the way of something very close. and the cottonwood at the corral edge smoked and split, and the gray filly Mae had been working the second one, the one she'd brought the furthest, the one she'd put her best 3 weeks into screamed. The sound a horse makes when it has crossed from alarm into genuine panic is not a sound that can be heard calmly if you have spent enough time with horses to understand what it means. It is specific, it bypasses interpretation and goes directly to action. Mae was moving before the echo of the lightning crack had finished rolling across the flat. The gray filly had been caught in the partial shelter of the fence line, just outside the barn's secondary entrance. She had reared at the lightning, and she came down wrong her momentum, carrying her front hooves in a wild forward arc that brought them in a sweeping diagonal path directly across the space where Mae was running. She registered the hooves. She registered that she could not reverse her momentum in the available distance. She registered in the fractional second available to register things that this was going to hurt, and then an arm hit her. Not struck, wrapped. One arm around her waist, enormous and immediate, and with a force that didn't hurt because it absorbed all of its own energy in the act of changing her direction, pulling her sideways and back in the same motion, a single decisive arc of force that relocated her body approximately 4 feet to the right in something under half a second. She went with it because she had no choice, and because the body understands, even when the mind is still processing, when it should surrender to a thing. She was against Holt's chest. His flannel shirt soaked through already from the rain that had started without ceremony, while they were getting his horses under cover. She could feel the full extent of his breathing, which was not calm, his chest moving with the compressed effort of a man who had been working hard for the past hour, and had just added a sprint to it. His arm was still around her waist. His other hand had come up to the back of her head, instinctively, in the way you shield something fragile from impact even when the impact has already been avoided. The gray filly's hooves came down on the ground 4 feet to the left of where Mae had been standing. The filly scrambled on the wet surface, found purchase, and bolted for the barn entrance, which was open and which she took at speed without looking back. Mae did not move. She was acutely aware of not moving as a deliberate act rather than paralysis. She was aware of the rain coming down in earnest now, warm and heavy, the smell of it on the parched ground, mixing with the smell of soaked leather, and the particular smell that was just him, work and weather, and something underneath both of those things that she did not have a better word for. She was aware of his heartbeat, not her own, his, against her cheek through the soaked flannel. She could feel the specific irregular speed of it, not the steady rhythm of a man in rest, but not pure adrenaline either. Something more complicated, something that was calibrating. His hand was still at the back of her head. She was aware of all of this for what was probably 6 seconds and felt like a geological period. Then she felt his posture change. Not his arm dropping, the change came earlier than the physical, a decision moving through his body before it reached his limbs. She stepped back from his chest before his arm released her, giving them both the small grace of not having it be an unwinding. He took a half step back. Rain ran from the brim of his hat in a continuous sheet. His face, when she looked at it, was doing several things at once. None of them simple. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Get inside." Not cold, not unkind. The specific instruction of a man who needed to be in motion before he could be in anything else, because standing still right now required him to be present in a way he had no architecture for. He walked into the barn. She went for the old bunkhouse, because inside was where he'd told her to go, and because the alternative was standing in the rain figuring out what had just happened, and she had better uses for her brain than that. She stood in the cabin and listened to the rain against the roof, and she thought, he didn't let go immediately, which meant something, and she knew what it meant. And knowing what it meant was both clarifying and alarming in approximately equal measure, because knowing what it meant required her to acknowledge what she felt, which she had been not quite acknowledging with considerable discipline for the better part of 3 weeks. The storm blew itself out by midnight. She knew because she was awake when it did. What followed the storm was a coldness from Holt that was nothing like the coldness she had felt from him at the beginning. That early coldness had been the baseline temperature of a man who had set his interior house to a particular degree and maintained it through effort and habit. This was different. This was a man who had briefly deviated from that temperature in a way he had not planned for, and was now working twice as hard to restore it, and the effort of the restoration was visible in a way the original baseline had not been. He stopped coming to the round pen fence. He routed his communication with her back through Pearl, not through Clem, notably, which told her he was not reversing his decisions about her work, only creating distance from his own proximity to her. Pearl delivered these communications with the expression of a woman who had opinions she was keeping to herself out of respect for everyone involved, which was its own kind of message. Mae worked the Phillies. She cared for Obsidian, who had lost none of his progress, and continued to show her the daily specific evidence of his trust, the way he turned before she reached the fence, the way his ears oriented to her footstep, from a distance that told her his hearing had committed her particular sound to a separate category. She treated legs and feet, and did the accounting of the barn that she had taken over from the system. Clem had kept on scraps of paper, with a methodology that suggested he had never expected anyone to review it. She did not seek Holt out. She understood, or believed she understood, the internal logic of what was happening to him. A man who has organized his life around an emotional position does not simply change positions because of 6 seconds in the rain. He requires time, or an event large enough to make the maintenance of the original position impossible, or both. Enforcing either of these things from outside was not how trust was built, which she knew better than most. But she missed the round pen fence. That was the honest version. She missed him standing there with his forearms on the top rail, not requiring anything from her. The particular quality of his attention that had always made her feel that the work she was doing was witnessed rather than merely supervised. She had not realized how much it had come to matter until it was withdrawn, which was the kind of information that arrived too late to be useful as a warning. And then Clem Darvish made his move. She almost missed it. Almost. Because the night it happened was the 14th night after the storm, a Thursday, and she had been up past midnight treating the gray filly's right knee, which had come up warm in a way she didn't like, and was monitoring closely. She came back to the cabin and slept harder than usual, and so she was asleep when whatever happened at the corral gate happened, and she didn't hear it, and in the morning Obsidian was gone. The corral gate stood open. The thick wooden pin that secured the latch, a pin she checked every single evening, as the last thing she did before leaving the corral, was on the ground in the dirt 12 inches from the gate post, not dangling in the place it would fall if someone had simply forgotten to replace it after themselves. Lying flat, laid down deliberately or knocked clear by a hand that knew what it was doing. She stood at the open gate for a count of 10, absorbing the specific quality of this information. Then she went to find Holt. She found Clem Darvish instead. Found him already positioned at the center of the yard, already speaking, already constructing the fact of a gathered audience from the hands who had started coming out for the morning, with their coffee and their flannel coats against the early chill. He had timed it. She understood this immediately and without anger, because anger was an expensive emotion and she needed her resources this morning for something else. I saw her out here last night. Clem's voice had the carrying quality of a man who had rehearsed his projection. He was addressing the assembled hands with the specific affect of regret, of reluctance to say a necessary thing. Later than she usually goes to that horse. I didn't think anything of it at the time. She's in and out of there all hours. That's her job. But the gate, he looked at the gate, shook his head. She was the last one near it. I can tell you that. The hands were listening. Not all of them were convinced. She could see the small differentiations. The slight sideway look of Hector Webb, the way Roy Briggs had gone very still in a way that meant he was doing arithmetic. But enough of them had heard enough of what Clem had been building for 3 weeks to create a weight in the air that tipped toward his version of the morning. Holt came from the main house. He covered the ground from the porch to the yard in the long, deliberate stride of a man who has woken to a crisis and is moving toward it with his full attention already committed. He took in the open gate, took in Clem, took in Mae, who was standing 6 feet from Clem, and had not yet said anything because she had been waiting for him to be present before she did. He looked at her, and this was the moment. This was the specific exchange she would return to afterward many times, turning it over in her hands like a stone that had a meaning she needed to decode. Because what she saw in his face was not accusation. It was not even suspicion exactly. It was the look of a man reaching for a wall that he thought was there and discovering it was thinner than he remembered, more permeable, and that frightened him more than the missing horse did, because the missing horse was a loss he knew how to metabolize. The other thing, the thing the wall was supposed to be protecting him from, he did not. Clem said, "I hate to say it, But she was the last one at that corral. Mae looked at Holt directly. I checked the latch pin at 10:30. It was in place. I do it every night. The pin is on the ground 12 inches from the post. If I had forgotten it, it would be hanging. You can see where it would hang. Silence. Holt looked at her, then at the gate, then at Clem. And in the moment that should have been the moment where a man who had spent 6 weeks watching her work, 6 weeks of her accuracy, 6 weeks of the evidence of who she actually was, made the obvious calculation, something else happened instead. His voice was flat and completely empty of everything that had been accumulating between them for weeks. Clem has been here 12 years, just that. Those words and everything they meant and everything they chose not to mean. Mae heard it land. She felt it land the way physical impacts land, first the force, then the spreading realization of what the force had done. She had been here less than 2 months, and she had no references and no history in this territory, and no one who could speak to who she was outside of what she had done in front of these people since she arrived. And Holt Granger, who had watched every hour of that, had made his choice, and his choice was the arithmetic of years, rather than the arithmetic of evidence. Because the evidence required him to trust what he felt, and trusting what he felt was the one thing he had organized his entire interior life to avoid. She understood. She understood it completely, and it still cut straight through. He said, "Go back to the kitchen. Help Pearl public." In front of all of them. He said it in front of the assembled hands and Clem Darvish and Roy Briggs and Hector Webb and every person whose regard she had earned one careful day at a time for 6 weeks. He stripped her of her work and her dignity in the same sentence, and he did it in the open air where all of them could hear it because he was too afraid of the alternative to find another way. She held his eyes for 3 full seconds. Not defiance, not performance. Just the last clear thing she had to offer, which was the evidence of what she was, available to him if he wanted it, and she was not going to look away from the possibility that he might see it even now. He looked at the ground. Mae nodded. One clean motion. She turned and walked toward the cookhouse at the same pace she walked everywhere, the pace that said she had decided to go this direction and gone in it, which was the only dignity available to her, and she took all of it. She heard the yard go quiet behind her. She did not turn around to read the quality of that quiet. She had made her appearance and it was done, and now she needed to be somewhere that was not in front of all of those people while she worked out what came next. Pearl was at the stove. She looked at Mae when she came through the cookhouse door, and her face did the thing it did when Pearl already knew something, which was nothing, which was the most expressive nothing Mae had ever encountered on a human face. Mae sat down on the bench along the cookhouse wall. She put her hands flat on her knees. She breathed. "He's wrong," Pearl said to the stove. "I know. He knows it too. That's the problem." Mae looked at her hands. The calluses were different now than they'd been when she came to the Granger spread, less from laundry, more from fence work and handling and the specific pressures of working animals that had never been properly gentled. Her hands had changed in the shape of this place. She had changed in the shape of this place. And the man who had watched that happen most closely had just told 12 people that 6 weeks of evidence counted for less than 12 years of prior arrangement, because the evidence required something from him he wasn't ready to give. She thought about her trunk. Her $3 folded in the dress hem. The blue calico dress she had finished 2 nights ago, and had not yet worn because the occasion had not presented itself, and she had been waiting for the occasion. She thought, "I cannot stay here," which was not the same as "I will leave." Not yet. Because leaving required a plan, and a plan required clear thinking, and she was not in clear thinking territory at the moment. She was in the territory just past the point where something expected finally happens, and you discover that having expected, it does not in fact prepare you for the weight of it. Pearl brought her a cup of coffee without being asked, set it down on the bench beside her, and went back to the stove and said nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. Mae wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside, she heard the sounds of the ranch continuing its morning horses' footsteps, the distant percussion of fence work in the south pasture, and somewhere in all of it, Obsidian was gone, and the gate pin was 12 inches from the post, and Clem Darvish, with kindness. And Clem Darvish was telling whoever would listen the version of this morning that he had built overnight, with the patience of a man who had 12 years of practice at constructing what he needed people to believe. She looked at the cookhouse door. She thought about Obsidian, not as a symbol, Not as anything except what he was, a horse that had been broken by the wrong kind of handling and had learned to trust one person after a very long time of trusting no one. A horse that was now somewhere on the open range with a bowed tendon that had only just finished healing and barbed wire fences in 3 directions along the creek drainage where the old fence lines ran. A horse that would not go to a stranger's hand. A horse that would not stop for anyone except the sound of one specific voice. The decision arrived without drama, the way decisions arrived when they were the only ones actually available. She had been going to leave before dawn. She would still leave before dawn. But she was not going to walk east toward Odell. Not yet. Not until she found the horse. The cabin held her for exactly 4 hours after she came in from the cookhouse. 4 hours of sitting, of thinking, of making and unmaking the same calculation until the numbers stopped changing and she had to accept what they kept coming out to. The blue calico dress hung on the peg by the door, the one she'd finished 2 nights ago, the one she hadn't worn yet. She looked at it for a while. Then she looked at her trunk, at the foot of the bunk, packed already in the way of someone who had been maintaining readiness for departure since the night she arrived, because that was the discipline of a woman who had never lived anywhere long enough to put down more than she could pick back up in 20 minutes. She packed the dress, folded it clean and careful, and laid it across the top of everything else. Then she sat back down on the bare ticking of the bunk mattress and put her hands on her knees and thought about Obsidian, not the injustice of the morning. Not Holt's voice saying the words that had taken all the mornings of the last 6 weeks and reframed them as insufficient. Not Clem Darvish's face when he had delivered his performance. The specific quality of his satisfaction, which was the satisfaction of a man who has finally found the right lever after weeks of looking. She thought about the horse. Because here was the problem with Obsidian. The problem was this: he would not go to a stranger. Would not, under any circumstances, allow a man who smelled of unfamiliarity to approach him without every barrier he had ever built going back up, thick and absolute, and bought at the price of whatever pain had originally built them. She had taken 3 weeks to earn the right to touch his face. She had taken 3 more weeks to earn the right to approach without the 20-yard buffer. And what she had given him in that time, the consistency, the voice, the presence that asked nothing and offered only itself, was not something that could be reconstructed by another person starting from the beginning. He was out there, with the healed tendon that was not fully seasoned yet. 3 miles of creek drainage in 2 directions, with old fence lines running through it, the wire rusted and sagging and half buried in the grass in places. Exactly the kind of thing a panicked horse encountered at a run and didn't see until it was already inside the damage. Cougars in the cedar breaks north of the creek. Ravines along the eastern drainage that were deeper than they looked from the rim. He was out there, and he would not go to anyone else, and she knew where he would go. Because she knew him now in the way you knew something after 6 weeks of daily specific attention. Not perfectly, but well enough to read the grain of him, the direction his instincts pulled, the landscape he would navigate by when fear and freedom intersected. He would follow the creek south, because the creek was water and familiar ground, and herd animals navigated by water when they didn't have a herd to navigate by. And 3 miles south along the creek, the terrain dropped into a wide, brushy gully that offered cover and a permanent spring, and she had seen him testing the southeast fence line twice in his early weeks in the corral. Always that direction, the way animals tested fence lines when they were thinking about the other side. She knew where he would go, and she could not leave him there. Not because of Holt Granger. Not because it would prove something to the hands who had watched her walk across the yard this morning. Because the horse had learned to trust one living person in what she estimated was a considerable history of not doing that. And he had done it slowly and at real cost to himself. Because trust was always a cost for something that had been hurt before it meant reopening the specific vulnerability that pain had taught you to seal, means walking back toward the thing that burned you with your eyes open and your decision made. He had done all of that, and she could not walk east toward Odell and leave him tangled in a fence line in the dark with no one who spoke his language within 3 miles. She didn't owe Holt Granger this. She understood that clearly. What she owed was simpler and older than any calculations involving Holt Granger. She owed it to the animal, because the animal had trusted her, and she did not break that kind of contract. Her father had taught her that too, though he would not have called it a contract. He would have called it just the way things were. She waited until the ranch went quiet. Not fully dark, she needed enough light to read the creek terrain. And a half moon was scheduled. She'd been tracking it for 2 weeks, out of the habit of a woman who had spent enough nights in open country to understand that the moon's schedule mattered. She waited until the lamps in the bunkhouse went to their low nighttime burn, until the cookhouse fire banked down, until the sounds of the main house settled into the particular quality of a place where one person was still awake but interior, contained, not likely to be looking outward. She put on the flannel coat, the worn one, not the new one from the blue calico yardage, because the worn one was quieter in the dark and had the ranch's smell in its fibers already, which would matter to the horses. She went to the small barn attached to the old bunkhouse. The mare she took was a buckskin named Chalk, 15 years old, calm as arithmetic, who barely lifted her head when Mae came in with the bridle, and who accepted it with the resignation of an animal that had long ago made its peace with humans and their midnight ideas. No saddle. She didn't want the creak of leather or the weight differential that changed how she sat. She'd ridden bareback since she was 8 years old, and her father's instruction had been definitive. A saddle is for when you have the luxury of one. She walked Chalk out the far side of the small barn and mounted from the fence rail and moved out into the dark at a walk, angling toward the south pasture fence and the creek gate that was never fully latched and hadn't been for 3 weeks, because she'd reported it twice to Clem, and twice he had done nothing. The Texas night was wide. The half moon was up, and it was enough to see the grass bend in the light wind, enough to read the fence lines as darker shapes against the dark ground, enough to keep the creek on her left by the sound of it when the breeze came right. Chalk moved without complaint, her hoofbeats soft in the dry grass, her ears in the comfortable mid-position of an animal that was neither alarmed nor enthusiastic, simply present. Mae let her mind go quiet, not empty. Quiet in the way of a tuned instrument, all the noise filtered out until only what mattered was left. The sound of the creek, the wind in the mesquite, the quality of the dark 200 yards ahead where the terrain began to drop toward the brushy gully. She started whistling when she was a quarter mile from the gully. Not loud. The specific low melodic run her father had used, not any song she had a name for, just a sequence of notes in a minor key that she had heard so many times in so many tack rooms and open camps that it had become part of her physical vocabulary the way breathing was. She had used it with Obsidian. Not every night. Only on the nights when the approach needed something different, when the horse was particularly wound up and needed something that preceded language and logic. He had responded to it. She had noted this and filed it and thought, useful. Please let it be useful now. The gully appeared out of the dark as the ground fell away. First the sound change as the creek widened in the hollow, then the smell of the permanent spring, sweeter and cooler than the running water upstream. She stopped Chalk at the rim and listened, breathing, the rapid, ragged kind, not running, struggling. She found him 40 feet into the gully, angled toward the spring, his left foreleg wrapped in 3 coils of old barbed wire from a fence line, so long abandoned that half the posts had rotted to nothing, and the wire had simply relaxed onto the ground where the grass had grown through it and camouflaged it in exactly the lethal way that barbed wire relaxed onto the ground in abandoned fence lines across 200 miles of Texas range. He had put his foot in it at a walk or a trot, not a run, she could tell from the pattern of the wound, the way the wire had taken him in a controlled spiral rather than the wild gouging of a horse that had hit it at speed. Small mercy, very small. The wire was through the skin in 2 places along the cannon bone and wrapped twice around the pastern, and he had been standing there long enough that the initial panic had given way to the particular stillness of an animal that had learned that movement made it worse. He was standing. That was the first thing. Standing on 3 legs with the 4th held off the ground at an angle that kept the wire from pulling, which meant some part of his brain had overridden panic and done the calculation. She had seen horses in similar situations that had pulled until they'd torn through muscle or broken bone or severed something that couldn't be repaired. He had not done that, which meant he was afraid and exhausted and in pain and still making decisions, which was one of the most specifically heartbreaking things she had ever seen. She came down the slope on foot, leaving Chalk ground-tied at the rim. Chalk would stay. She was that kind of horse, the kind that understood the contract of ground-tying and honored it. She moved down the loose shale of the gully edge slowly. Not urgently, the melody first, pitched just loud enough to carry over the sound of the spring. Then, when he turned his head toward the sound and she could see the white of his eye going from full moon round to the beginning of something less than that. Easy, it's just me. You know what that sounds like. You know what I sound like. Not for him. He could hear who she was before she said it. But saying it out loud steadied her own hands, which was the other thing talking to frightened animals was for. He was trembling from the left shoulder to the flank, the sustained fine trembling of a muscle group that has been in isometric contraction for too long, holding the wire-caught leg still against the instinct to pull. She put her hand on his neck and felt the trembling travel through her palm and up her arm, and she felt her jaw tighten with the precise controlled anger of someone who knows exactly who is responsible for a specific injustice and is filing it in a place she can retrieve it from later when she has time. The wire, she needed something to cut it. She had her folding knife. The blade was 3 inches and sharp enough for most work, but the wire gauge was not the thin stuff of modern fence, it was old heavy wire. The kind put up in the 1870s when fence meant something serious. And 3-inch blade on that gauge wire was going to take longer than she wanted. She was working the first coil, Obsidian's neck against her shoulder, his breathing coming slower by increments as she kept the melody running under her breath, when she heard hooves at the rim of the gully. Plural. One horse carrying significant weight, picking its way carefully down the shale slope. She did not stop working the wire. She tracked the sound without looking up, because looking up meant stopping the melody, and stopping the melody meant losing the particular quality of Obsidian's trembling that was currently at manageable rather than dangerous. Stay back. Not loud. Projected clearly. If he sees you before I've got the first coil clear, he'll pull and the second coil will take the artery. The hoofbeats stopped. Then she heard him dismount. The sound of a man of Holt Granger's size and weight landing from a horse was specific and distinctive. She knew it by now. She knew it the way she knew the sound of the cookhouse stove drafting in the morning or the specific creak of the second post on the round pen fence. She kept working. The first coil took 6 minutes. She knew because she had started counting when she began, the way her father had taught her to count when the hands needed to be busy and the mind needed to not be watching the clock. 6 minutes of the blade working the wire at the gap between the first and second twist, Obsidian breathing, her voice running low and continuous, the spring water in the dark behind them. The coil separated with a sound like a small bell, a single clear note of tension releasing. Obsidian lurched forward half a step, the instinct to run at the release of any restraint, and her hand was already at his halter ring, not gripping, just present, and he stopped, checked himself. Stood. She said, "There's a second coil at the pastern. I need the wire cutters that are in the right saddlebag." A pause. Then footsteps coming down the shale, carefully controlled, wide-footed, a man who understood how to move on bad ground. He stopped 6 feet from her, which was the right distance, and she heard the bag open. Left-hand pocket. They'll be in a canvas roll. The wire cutters arrived in her peripheral vision, held out handle first. She took them without looking at his face because she was not ready to look at his face, and also because Obsidian had started the fine trembling again at the approach of a second person, and her attention was not available for anything else. She used the cutters on the second coil at the join point, and it was 30 seconds of work, and then the wire fell away from the pastern, and Obsidian put his foot down on the ground and she watched the leg take weight. It shook. He lifted it again, set it down again. The wire had not gone through anything critical, she could tell from the placement and depth of the 2 lacerations, which were bad but not catastrophic, which would need cleaning and wrapping and careful management for the next 3 weeks, but which would heal. She exhaled. Her breath went out of her in a long, sustained release that she had not known she was holding. Holt was standing 6 feet from her in the half-moon dark, and she could feel his presence the way you felt a weather change, not through any specific input, but through the aggregate of air and temperature, and something beneath both of those things. She looked at him. He looked wrecked. Not physically. He had ridden hard to get here. She could see that in the horse he'd brought, a roan that was breathing the deep rhythmic breath of recent exertion, but the wrecked quality was not physical. It was in the specific way his face was arranged, which was the arrangement of a man who has recognized something about himself in the past several hours, and the recognition has not been comfortable. He said, "Roy Briggs came to me." She waited. Around midnight. He said he'd seen Clem at the corral the night before, standing there in the dark. He said he thought it was strange but didn't know what to do with it. She waited more. I went to your cabin, you were already gone. A pause. The full weight of what that meant landing visibly on his face. The trunk was still there. And that was when she understood what he had thought. When he'd come to the cabin and found it empty and saw the trunk still there. When she could have taken it, when leaving with the trunk was the rational choice for someone who was leaving, he had understood what she had done instead. And that understanding had brought him here. His voice when he continued was stripped of the flattened quality it had carried all day, the affect of careful distance. What replaced it was not performance, was not the managed version of himself he presented to the world. I told you Clem had been here 12 years. He stopped, started again. That was a coward's answer. I had a better one and I gave you the coward's version, because the better answer required me to trust what I know, and I have been another stop. He pushed through it. I have been deciding not to know things that required something from me, for 2 years. It's become a habit I can't seem to break. Mae looked at Obsidian. The horse was putting steady weight on the injured leg now, testing it in the careful incremental way of an animal doing its own assessment of damage. She said Clem lied. I know. I checked that latch pin at 10:30. It was in, I know that too. You knew it this morning. He did not try to argue the tense, yes. She looked at him then. Directly, the way she had been doing since the first morning at the fence, when she'd spoken about the horse and he'd turned around and assessed her like something he didn't have a category for yet. She looked at him, and she let the full weight of the morning land in the space between them, not as accusation, but as fact. Because he had earned the discomfort of it, and he knew he had, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. You took the coward's answer in front of 12 people, she said, including the ones who have been deciding whether to trust me based on what they see you do.
Yes.
That's not a small thing to fix.
No.
His jaw set. It's not. They stood in the gully with the horse between them and the creek water, over the rocks, and the half-moon burning its cold light down through the cedars on the rim. Mae thought about her trunk at the foot of the bunk, packed and ready, the blue calico dress on top. She thought about the $3 folded in the hem of the other dress. She thought about the specific quality of the second Saturday supper, when he'd talked about his father and the way the house had grown in increments that reflected what the land had given up. She thought, this is not a man who doesn't know how to be honest. This is a man who learned to be afraid of what honesty costs, which is different, and different problems had different solutions. I need to get him back and get the leg cleaned, she said. He can't carry weight on it tonight. I'll lead him. He won't go with you, a beat. He looked at the horse, who was watching him with the ears-back wariness that was Obsidian's default setting for all humans except one. Then tell me what to do and I'll do it. Not, let me handle this. Not, I know better. What to do and I'll do it. Which was a different sentence from any sentence she had heard him construct before. And she filed it in the same place. She filed everything about him that was more than she expected. She told him, stay at her shoulder, not in front of her. Speak at normal volume if he needed to speak, because silence was actually more alarming to a horse than a calm voice. Keep the roan between himself and Obsidian at the start of the walk, giving Obsidian a familiar species to orient to, rather than a human he didn't trust. He did all of it, precisely and without modification, which was the discipline of a man who knew how to take instruction when he had decided it was the right instruction, which she suspected was not a common experience for him. They went up the gully slope slowly. Obsidian took the incline three-legged, his injured leg barely touching, and Mae kept her shoulder under his neck at the difficult moments, taking what fraction of his weight he would give her. At the rim, chalk was exactly where she'd left her, ground-tied, ears in the same mid-position of mild interest. Obsidian noted her, and the note visibly settled something in him, the presence of a known quantity in unfamiliar territory. The walk back was 2 miles, and it took the better part of an hour. Mae kept the melody going intermittently, her voice low, Obsidian's head close to her shoulder, Holt on the other side of the roan at the distance she'd specified. The half-moon tracked its arc. The creek ran on the left. The dry grass held their footsteps softly. Holt spoke once, partway through. Not about Clem, not about the morning. He said, I used to walk this section with Ruth in the evenings. She liked the sound of the creek after dark. He paused. She would have had opinions about you. Mae thought about what that meant, about the specific register of it, which was not comparison but something else, acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that his past and his present existed in the same world and did not have to be kept in separate rooms. She said, "Good opinions or complicated ones." His voice had something in it that was almost not quite, but almost something lighter than what it usually held. Probably both. She had strong opinions about competent women. She was one herself. Then I would have liked her. Yes, he said. I think you would have. They walked in the quiet after that, and it was not the quiet of two people who had run out of things to say. It was the quiet of two people who had arrived somewhere that required sitting with rather than filling. At the barn, she worked on Obsidian's leg by lantern light, cleaned both lacerations with the diluted iodine solution from the supply shelf, wincing at the horse's flinch, without letting the wince travel to her hands, which stayed steady because he needed them steady. Wrapped the leg in clean cotton batting, and then a proper standing bandage that would keep the compression even through the night. Obsidian tolerated all of it, pressing his nose into her hair at one point in a way that suggested he was confirming her continued presence, rather than expressing affection. Though maybe, after 6 weeks, the distinction had blurred somewhat. Holt held the lantern. He did not try to assist with the legwork. He understood when to stay out of the way, which was a quality she had noticed before, but which landed differently now, in the 3 a.m. lamplight with the barn smelling of horse and clean straw. When she finished and stood and pressed both hands into the small of her back where the sustained crouch had made itself known, he said, "What you did tonight going out alone to find him, that wasn't for me." "No, I know." A pause. "That's why it matters." She looked at him in the lantern light. The angles of his face in that particular warm yellow, the jaw, the set of his eyes, the line of his mouth, which was not smiling but had something in it that was adjacent to the willingness to. "The person who opened that corral gate is the person you've trusted for 12 years, she said. "That's going to need addressing. Tomorrow, it needs to be public. The way this morning was public." Yes. No hesitation. He had already made this decision before she said it. She could tell. It will be. She believed him. Not because she was inclined toward optimism, which she was not particularly. Because he was a man whose decisions, once made, held. She had watched enough of them to know the texture of a Holt Granger conclusion. It had the quality of stone, of ground leveled and tamped. He would do what he said he would do because it had not occurred to him to operate otherwise. And the 2 years of grief-driven retreat had not changed that essential architecture, only sealed it behind a wall she had been standing near for 6 weeks. She asked, "How did you know where to find me, the creek?" "Just the creek and Roy. Roy said you'd gone toward the south pasture gate." He paused. "The rest I figured from watching you with the horse. I knew you'd go where he'd go. And that was the thing, wasn't it? The thing underneath the thing. He had found her because he had been paying enough attention to know how she thought. Not her words, not her stated reasoning, her actual thinking, the way it moved, what it followed when it was following its own logic. And that level of attention was not something a man deployed without understanding what it meant. She felt it land fully. "Let it," she said. "I was going to leave before dawn, I know. I'm not leaving." The lantern between them made the light irregular, moving with the barn's small night drafts. He stood in it and looked at her with the full unguarded quality she had seen only in fragments before at the fence in the evening, in the round pen once, in the doorway of the main house the morning after the storm, when he'd looked at her across the yard and then looked at the ground. No fragments now. The whole of it, which was, she thought, a great deal of Holt Granger, to receive at 3 a.m. after the night they'd had. But she received it, without looking away and without performing a response to it, both of which would have been the wrong things. He said, "Go to bed. We'll deal with the morning when it comes." She looked at Obsidian, who was standing square on all 4 feet now, the bandaged leg taking weight with only a slight favoring. Alive. Returning slowly to himself. She touched his nose once, the broad, warm flat of it, the velvet skin, and he breathed out against her hand. She picked up her flannel coat from the stall door where she'd draped it, and she walked out of the barn into the very early Texas morning, where the dark was just beginning to consider the gray that preceded dawn. The cookhouse was dark. The bunkhouse was dark. The main house had 1 lamp in 1 window, the study, which had been burning when she left and was still burning now. She did not look at the window. She thought about it all the way back to the old bunkhouse, which was the same as looking at it in every way that mattered. Inside, she hung the flannel coat on the peg next to the blue calico dress, sat down on the bunk, put her hands on her knees in the posture she returned to when she needed to think clearly, and she thought, Clem Darvish would have to be removed publicly and without ambiguity, because 12 years of his authority over those men was not dismantled by a quiet, private conversation that left room for interpretation. There was no version of tomorrow that worked for anyone on this ranch if Clem Darvish remained on it, and she thought Holt understood this with the same clarity that he understood all direct logical conclusions completely, once he'd faced the direction they were coming from. The hands would need time. Hector Webb less. Roy not at all. Roy had already made his choice and proven it tonight. Others would take longer. That was acceptable. She had been patient before, and she could be patient again, and patience, she had found, was not the passive thing people assumed it was. Patience was a decision renewed every morning, which was its own kind of strength. And Holt was a problem for which she did not have a clean framework, which was unusual for her. She tended to understand problems in terms of what they required, and then apply the requirement. Obsidian had required consistency and time, and the absence of demand. The Phillies had required structure and patience, and the belief that they were capable of the thing being asked of them. The ranch's veterinary disorder had required someone willing to look at what was actually there, rather than what was convenient to see. What Holt required she thought she understood. But understanding it, and being the person positioned to provide it were two different things, and the second one required her to make a choice about what she was willing to stand in the way of. What she was willing to have matter to her in a place where everything she'd cared about before had been either taken or left behind in one ordinary town in Kansas or another. She was tired, genuinely tired in the way that lived below the physical, in the place where the self kept its reserves. She was tired of being careful in the specific sense of holding herself at the edge of things she wanted. She had been at the edge of this particular thing for 6 weeks, and the edge had held, and she had been correct to stay on it, and also she was very tired of it. The blue calico dress hung on its peg. The trunk sat at the foot of the bunk. Outside, something in the south pasture made a single sound, a mare, she thought, calling toward the barn, checking that the herd was still configured the way she'd left it. Mae lay down on the bunk without undressing. She thought about what Holt had said about Ruth. Both things, the first, which was the information about what Ruth was like, and the implication that Mae's character was legible enough to generate a specific comparison. And the second, which was simpler and landed somewhere below language, I think you would have. Past tense about Ruth, present tense about Mae, and the ease with which he had held both in one sentence, as if they could exist in the same space without one destroying the other. She closed her eyes. She thought, tomorrow is going to require something of you. More than tonight did, which was the straightforward kind of hard. Tomorrow was the complicated kind, the kind that required you to be simultaneously certain and patient, visible and careful, all the contradictory things that living in community, with people who were making up their minds about you required. She thought, you have done hard things before. You have done them alone, and without resources and with worse odds than these. She thought, and none of them have had a window lit in the study at 3 in the morning, while you were out in the dark with the horse. That thought she let alone. For now, she lay on the bunk without undressing for the 3 hours that remained before dawn. Not sleeping, thinking, but not the churning kind of thinking that exhausted a person without producing anything useful. The settled kind. The kind that came after a decision had been made, and all that remained was to let it finish arriving. Outside the bunkhouse window, the dark held its Texas depth, the particular density of 3 in the morning, when even the animals had stopped their nighttime sounds, and the whole flat world was just waiting for the sun to remember its job. She thought about what Holt had said in the gully. Not the apology had been necessary, and he had made it without dressing it up, which was the only kind of apology she had ever found useful. She thought about the other thing. The trunk was still there. 4 words, said in the dark of a creek gully, with a hurt horse between them and wire cuts on her hands. And those 4 words had told her everything she needed to know about what he had understood when he came to the empty cabin and found her gone without her luggage. He had understood that she had not left. He had understood why. And he had ridden 3 miles in the dark to find a woman who was cutting wire off a horse she didn't owe anything to, for a man who had failed her that morning in front of 12 people, and he had not made it about himself when he got there. He had asked what she needed, and then he had done it. She had been cataloging this kind of thing for 6 weeks without letting herself add it up. The blanket assignment reversed without fanfare. The package on the cabin table. The 45 minutes at Wilson's Dry Goods that Pearl had seen fit to mention at the right moment. The way he had looked at her across Obsidian's back when the horse finally exhaled from the colic crisis, not with relief exactly, but with the expression of a man seeing something he had been trying not to see clearly suddenly come into focus. She had been careful. She had been so careful. And somewhere between the gully and the barn, and the lantern light and the bandaged leg and I'm not leaving, she had run out of careful. Not because she had been careless, because careful had done its job, which was to make sure that what she felt was real, and not the product of desperation or proximity, or the particular vulnerability of a woman who had arrived in a strange place with nothing. It was real. She had done the work of making sure, and it was real, and now there was nothing left to do but let it be what it was. She closed her eyes. She thought, tomorrow is going to require everything you have. The particular kind of everything that looks like ordinary work standing in a yard, speaking in a measured voice, not flinching when it counts. She thought, you have been doing that your whole life. This is just the morning where it matters most. And the dark outside the window went from the density of 3 in the morning to the thin gray that preceded color. And Mae Sutton let herself sleep for the first time since any of this had begun. When the orange came, it came fast. The way October dawns came in Texas, not a suggestion but a declaration, the whole eastern sky committing at once to the business of a new day. Mae was already awake. She had woken with the gray and lain still for the 10 minutes it took the light to decide what it was going to be. And then she got up. She put on the blue calico dress. Her hands were steady on the buttons. She had made this dress from cloth a man chose by holding bolts to a window to see the colors true, and she had finished the last seam by lamplight 2 nights ago, with the small specific satisfaction of work completed, and she had not worn it yet because she had been waiting for the occasion, and the occasion had not arrived until now. She smoothed the front seam and looked in the small mirror on the bunkhouse wall not long, just enough to see that she looked like herself. The version of herself that had existed before the letters from Earl Cobb and the sold pocket watch and the 2,000 miles of bad luck. The actual Mae Sutton, underneath all the circumstances. She took her flannel coat off the peg and went out into the morning. The yard was quiet at this hour. The cookhouse had smoke already, Pearl's fire, Pearl's coffee, the serious machinery of the ranch's day beginning before anyone else's had technically started. Mae stood for a moment on the bunkhouse step and breathed the October air, which was cold at the edges and smelled of dry grass and the creek and wood smoke and the horses shifting in the morning pasture. Holt was at the main working corral fence. His back was to the house, his hat on, his brown leather vest over the dark flannel he'd worn through the night. His hands were at his sides, not crossed, not in his pockets. The posture she had come to read as waiting, which was different from his posture of assessment, and different again from the posture of a man simply occupying space. He was waiting for the day, for the men to come out, for the thing he had decided was going to happen this morning to arrive at the moment it could happen. He heard her cross the yard. She knew because his head changed angle, the small adjustment of someone tracking a sound they had been waiting for. And then he turned fully and looked at her. He looked at the blue calico dress for a long moment. She let him look. After the night they'd had, after everything the darkness had required of both of them, letting him look at her in the morning light in the dress he'd chosen the fabric for seemed like the right thing to offer. Then he looked at her face, and something in his expression did the thing she had catalogued only a handful of times across 6 weeks, the controlled surface parting, the actual weather of him coming through. He had more weather inside than he ever showed. She had known this from early on and had been patient with it, and now here it was in the early October gold, unmanaged and real. He said, "You stayed." Not relief, not surprise. Just the full weight of the fact, stated by a man who understood what it meant, which was its own kind of answer to the question neither of them had said out loud. "I said I would." She stopped 6 feet from him, near enough for the conversation they were about to have, far enough that they were still 2 separate people. "How's the leg?" "I checked at 5. He's bearing weight." A pause briefer than usual. "He called for you when he heard the cookhouse fire start." She looked toward Obsidian's corral. The horse was at the near fence, had been there. She suspected, since before she came out of the bunkhouse. His black coat caught the first orange of the morning, and held it differently than anything else in the yard, the way very dark things held light by changing its quality. His ears were in the forward position he reserved for things he had decided about. He was looking at her across 40 feet of yard with the fixed attention of a creature who had done the slow, difficult work of choosing to trust one person and had woken up this morning to confirm the choice was still available to him. She felt it in her chest, the weight of being chosen. Not taken, not assigned. Chosen, she said. I'll check him after. Holt agreed. The hands came out by ones and twos between 5:30 and 6, the way they always came, the quick ones first, the ones who needed Pearl's coffee to locate themselves arriving a few minutes behind. They moved through their morning patterns and found Holt Granger standing still in the center of his own yard, not moving toward any particular task, and that fact alone reorganized the morning. Every hand on the Granger spread understood without being told what it meant when Holt Granger stood still at 6 in the morning. It meant something had been decided. It meant the day was going to be different from the day before. They gathered, not summoned, just drawn by the gravity of a man who had made up his mind. Clem Darvish came out last. He came from the foreman's private room at the end of the main bunkhouse in his flannel striped shirt already tucked, suspenders already on, hat in place, the deliberate grooming of a man who understood that appearances were a form of argument and had been making that argument for 12 years. He came out and read the assembled yard with the practiced speed of someone who had been reading rooms for a long time, and his face did its rapid calculations. He saw Mae in the blue calico. His eyes moved to her, and away and back because the dress was new information he was trying to place, and the placing was giving him something he didn't want to receive. He saw Holt in the center of the yard. He stopped. Holt waited until Clem was fully on the packed earth, fully present. No possibility of retreat to claim he hadn't heard. He waited with the patience of a man who had decided what was going to happen, and was not in any hurry because the outcome was already fixed. It had been fixed sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning, when he had gone to a gully 3 miles down the creek, and found a woman cutting wire off a horse she didn't have to save, for a man who had failed her, because the horse needed it done and she was the one who could do it. He said, "Roy Briggs." Roy straightened from the corral fence. His faded flannel shirt was tucked for Roy, a signal of moral seriousness. His jaw set and his voice came out steadier than Mae expected from a man his age in this situation. "I saw Clem Darvish at Obsidian's corral the night before the horse went missing. After midnight. I was coming back from the south pasture check. He was just standing there in the dark. I didn't know what to make of it then. But when the horse was gone in the morning and Mae was accused, he stopped, restarted with more precision. I knew the timing didn't sit right. The yard held its quiet, the kind of quiet that was not passive, the kind that leaned in." Holt looked at Clem. Clem's face moved through its versions quickly, the assessment face still working angles, then the harder face of a man recognizing the angles had closed, then the last face, the one about salvage. He said, "The boy doesn't know what he saw." Holt's voice was what it was on the 3 occasions Mae had heard him use it, the voice that had no need of volume because it was already the most significant thing in any space it occupied. Quiet. Absolute. "You have worked on this ranch for 12 years. Here is what that counted for. It counted for the fact that I am not asking the sheriff to ride out this morning. That is what 12 years bought you. The conversation ends here." Clem opened his mouth. "You have until noon. Nothing else. No elaboration." Because Holt Granger had never in his life found it necessary to repeat himself, and this was not the morning he was going to start. He let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to face the assembled hands, 12 men, in flannel and canvas and worn leather, who had spent 6 weeks forming their opinions about Mae Sutton, from a combination of what she'd shown them, and what Clem Darvish had told them in the dark of the bunkhouse when he thought no one important was listening. Mae Sutton saved this ranch's best horse twice. She saved a mare and her foal that Clem had written off. She fixed the roan gelding's thrush that nobody else had bothered to look at. She gentled 6 fillies that Clem said were too far gone. He paused. Last night, when every person on this property was asleep, she went out alone in the dark and found Obsidian tangled in a fence line 3 miles down the creek and cut him free with her hands. His voice didn't change in volume or temperature, but it carried into the full attention of 12 men who were listening with everything they had. "I made an error yesterday morning. I chose 12 years of arrangement over 6 weeks of evidence, and the evidence was better. That error was mine, and it was made in public, and so is this. Nobody moved. The kind of stillness that was the full weight of men who had understood something and were absorbing what that understanding required of them. Holt turned back to Mae, in front of all 12 of them. Clem Darvish at the edge of the group with his hat in his hands. For the first time, Mae had seen him without it. Pearl in the cookhouse doorway with her arms crossed, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for the world to catch up to the obvious and was prepared to feel the satisfaction of it. Holt turned to Mae in the blue calico dress made from his fabric cut by her hands, and he said, "The stable is yours. The ranch is yours to run alongside me if you'll have it. And anything else you want to discuss, we'll discuss it when these men have had their breakfast and gone to work. Anything else you want to discuss," said in front of 12 people and a cook who already knew everything, and a departing foreman who now understood the full extent of what he had miscalculated. Holt Granger was not a subtle man. Mae had known this for 6 weeks. She had been paying attention. She said, "All right," 2 words. But these particular 2 words, said in this particular morning light in the blue calico dress, meant the fullest version of yes she had ever meant by anything. Holt nodded once. "Breakfast," he said to the assembled hands, and the yard reorganized itself around the new morning because Holt Granger had spoken, and what he'd said was the reality now, and the Granger Ranch had never been a place that wasted time on realities already established. Clem Darvish walked back to the bunkhouse. Nobody watched him go. Not indifference, it had simply ceased to be the most important thing that had happened in the last 10 minutes. Hector Webb passed Mae on his way to the cookhouse. 50 years old, gray-bearded, the economy of movement of a man who had been doing physical work for 30 years and had learned not to waste any part of it. He had been the first to nod at her on her 3rd morning at the ranch, before any of this had become what it became. He looked at her as he passed and he said, "Good dress." Then he went inside for his coffee. Roy Briggs was the last to move. He stood at the corral fence in his faded flannel, with his hat pushed back the way it went when he was relieved rather than merely satisfied. He looked at Mae, with the expression of a young man who had done the right thing and discovered it felt more like the completion of something than the achievement of something. He touched the brim of his hat, went inside. Mae stood in the yard. The orange had given way to the full gold of a clear October morning, the kind of light that made everything it touched look exactly like what it actually was: the fence lines, the barn roof, the long mesquite, the main house with its additions built in increments that reflected what the land had given up year by year. All of it in gold, all of it hers to be part of, if she chose it. If she said yes to the question that hadn't been asked yet but was already decided, she went to Obsidian. He was at the near fence when she got there, which she had known he would be. She put her hand on the top rail and he put his nose against her wrist, the broad, warm velvet of him. The breath of an animal that had woken up this morning and found the world arranged the way it needed to be. She checked his leg through the fence rails. Bandage holding, weight even, the trajectory she wanted. She said quietly to him and to the October morning and to no one in particular, "You're going to be fine." He breathed on her wrist, which she counted as agreement. Pearl called her in for breakfast at 6:30 in the tone of a woman who had decided the social portion of the morning was concluded and the fuel portion was now required. Mae went. Pearl had set her plate in the middle of the long table, not the end where she had been eating alone for 6 weeks, the middle where a person sat who belonged there. Pearl poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her, which Pearl did not do at breakfast in the general way of things, and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been patient with the world's slowness and was now prepared to enjoy having been right. "He bought that calico from Wilson's Dry Goods," Pearl said. "Took 45 minutes. He held 3 different bolts up to the window to see them in the natural light." She drank her coffee. "I know because Wilson told me. Everyone in Odell tells me things eventually." "You could have told me," Mae said. "Could have." Pearl set her cup down. "But then you'd have known what you already knew. And the difference between knowing a thing privately and knowing it with someone else's confirmation is the difference between your decision and someone else's story." Mae considered this. It was one of the most accurate things she had heard said about anything. "He chose the right blue." "He chose the exact right blue," Pearl said, with the satisfaction of a woman whose judgment had been validated by events. The day ran forward the way days ran on the Granger spread, not in spite of what had happened but through it. The ranch's daily requirements remaining exactly what they were, and the people in it meeting those requirements with the efficiency of a place that did not depend on any single person's drama to function. Roy took the south pasture fence check without being told because it needed doing. Hector Webb organized the feeding rotation with the quiet authority of a man who had been doing it in practice, regardless of whose title covered it. The ranch was larger than the morning's events, and it moved accordingly. Mae worked Obsidian's leg at noon, clean cotton, fresh wrap, checked the lacerations for heat and swelling, and found the numbers moving in the right direction. He stood for all of it with the patience of a horse that had filed her under known quantity and no longer burned energy on vigilance where she was concerned. Holt came to the barn while she was finishing. He moved through the space the way he moved through all spaces, taking its measure first, placing himself deliberately, the physical fact of him at 6'4", reorganizing the geometry of the barn, the way it reorganized every room he entered. He looked at the leg, at the bandage work, at how the horse stood. He assessed accurately and quickly the way he did everything he cared about. He said, "Pearl has supper set for 6. She tied off the last wrap. Invitation or information?" A pause that had something in it she recognized. Both. She stood from the crouch. Obsidian turned his head toward Holt in the doorway and held the assessment ears in the mid-position of a horse, deciding whether to upgrade a person's classification. Not the full forward trust he showed Mae, but not the flatback wariness of threat either. Something in between. Something that was the beginning of a different accounting. She watched the horse look at the man. She said, "Give him your hand." Holt looked at her, then at the horse. He stepped forward into the barn and extended his right hand toward Obsidian's fence, not reaching, not demanding, just present, palm down, the way you offered something you were willing for the other party to refuse. Obsidian looked at the hand for a long moment. His ears moved through several positions. His nostrils took the information available in the barn air. He was doing the calculation he always did, not whether the person was dangerous in the abstract, but whether the person was dangerous to him specifically, which was a more precise and more reliable question. He stepped forward and put his nose against Holt's knuckles. One breath. The soft pressure of a 1,700-pound animal making a decision about a person and landing on provisional acceptance. Then he stepped back and turned, and dropped his head to the water trough, which was Obsidian's way of saying, "Noted, filed, this conversation is complete for now." Holt lowered his hand. He stood in the barn in the October light coming through the gaps in the boards and looked at the horse, and then at Mae, and in his face was the thing she had been watching move toward the surface for 6 weeks, not broken open, not dramatic, just finally arrived. The weather she had always known was there, standing in the full light of a barn in October, making no attempt to go back inside. She said, "He's going to be a good horse." Holt said, "He already is. He just needed someone to know the difference between an animal that can't be trusted and one that hasn't been given a reason to trust yet." She looked at him. "That's not just about the horse." "No," he said. "It's not." They stood in the barn for a moment, the horse at his water trough, the October light in its long lines through the boards, the smell of clean straw and the particular quality of a silence that had nothing unresolved in it. 6, she said. "I'll be there." Pearl set the supper table the way she set it on Saturday's pressed linen pewter candlesticks, the heavy plates that had outlasted 2 decades of ranch use through the quality of their material. She cooked a roast that filled the main house with beef and sage and something underneath both. She ate in the kitchen, as always, giving the room what it needed. Mae sat where Pearl directed, partway down the side of the long table, close enough for conversation, not the theatrical distance of formality. The candle between them was new. Taller than the Saturday ones, the kind meant to last through an evening that might go long. They ate in the quiet of people who had enough between them that silence was a form of participation. The roast, the October dark settling beyond the windows, the main house holding its familiar sounds around them. Then Holt set down his fork. "I need to say something, and I want to say it clearly." He paused, not hesitation, preparation, the way he prepared for things he intended to say exactly right. "What I did yesterday morning was not a mistake made in haste. I knew you hadn't touched that gate. I knew it the way I know the state of my own pastures through 6 weeks of evidence I had been accumulating and had decided to trust, until the moment it required something from me I wasn't ready to give." Another pause, shorter. "I have been making decisions from fear for 2 years. I have been calling it practicality, and I have been letting it pass as that because there was no one here who required me to call it what it was. Mae looked at the candle between them. And what was it? Grief I wasn't finished with, because being finished with it meant being available for something else. And being available meant I could lose something else. The candle had burned down a half-inch from when they sat. She had been watching it in her peripheral vision, the way you watched something adjacent to the thing you were actually watching. She said, "I'm not easy to lose." It came out quiet and without performance and entirely true. Not a boast. A fact she had established over 28 years of practice and knew the quality of. He looked at her, and the surface of him, the managed surface, the one he maintained as a professional disposition, came apart fully, not dramatically, just finally, the way a window comes open when someone decides to let the air through. "No," he said. "I don't think you are." She put down her fork, because what came next deserved her full attention, and she was not a woman who divided that. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want to be clear about that before you say whatever you're going to say. I'm telling you this so that whatever it is, you say it knowing it's not a condition. I'm not asking from scarcity." He looked at her for a long time. Not the assessment look that one she knew well had felt on her since the first morning at the gate with Obsidian screaming in the corral behind him. This was something further along the road from assessment. Recognition. Sustained and undefended. The kind that came when you had been watching something clearly for long enough that pretending not to see it became more effort than seeing it. "Mae Sutton," he said. "Will you stay on this ranch as my wife? Not will you consider?" Not I was thinking. The full question, stated in the direct manner of a man who had made his decision and was telling her what it was, which was how Holt Granger communicated everything that actually mattered to him. She thought, for one brief moment, careful. And then she thought, you have been careful for 6 weeks. You have been careful for your entire life. Careful got you through Kansas and Oklahoma and Missouri and a stagecoach ride and a dead man's farm and the closed doors of a town that had written your story before you arrived. Careful has done its job. You checked the work. It's real. You are 28 years old, sitting across a table from a man who spent 45 minutes picking the right shade of blue, who rode 3 miles in the dark because a trunk at the foot of a bunk told him you had gone toward the horse instead of toward the road. "Yes," she said. One word. The same weight as the trunk left behind. The same weight as going toward the gully instead of toward Odell. The same logic. This is the thing I choose. And I choose it with my eyes open and my mind clear. And I'm done pretending I haven't already decided. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was what it had always been, the hand of a man who had done the physical work of building and keeping a place for 25 years, calloused and broad. The hand that had held a lantern in a gully at 2 a.m. and held Obsidian's halter through 4 hours of colic crisis. She turned her palm up under his and he closed his fingers around her hand, with the careful specific force of someone who had decided to hold something and understood what holding something right required. The candle burned between them. Pearl's roast cooled on the plates. The main house settled into its October sounds around them. Then Holt said, "Roy Briggs is going to need something to do with himself now that there's no foreman telling him where to be." Mae said, "He's been doing it already. He just needs the title." "I thought so too. He's good with the horses. Better than he knows." She looked at their hands on the table, then at him. "You're going to have to let me work the horses the way I work them." "I know. Including Obsidian. Especially Obsidian." The candle had burned down another 1/4 inch. Outside, an owl called from the direction of the creek and was answered by nothing, which in Texas at night was not an absence but a kind of punctuation. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, because Thursday was the day the ranch work ran lightest, and Holt Granger ran his ranch on the principle that work came first and ceremonies arranged themselves accordingly, which Mae had no objection to because she had been living by the same principle her entire life. Reverend Whitmore stood in the Odell church in his black ministerial vest and performed the ceremony. Roy Briggs came in a clean flannel shirt that Pearl had pressed for the occasion. Hector Webb wore his best wool vest, the dark brown one he kept for occasions worth the wool. Pearl wore a dress Mae had not seen before, dark blue wool, worn with the dignity of a woman who had opinions about occasions and dressed to meet them. Mrs. Pickford arrived uninvited and took a seat in the 3rd row and wore the expression of someone present at an event they had determined to be legitimate. which from Mrs. Pickford was as close to a blessing as anyone could reasonably expect. When Reverend Whitmore reached the vow, Mae looked at Holt and Holt looked at her, and even Reverend Whitmore's, a man who had been performing weddings for 20 years and had learned to hold a professional distance from the emotional content of the occasion, looked away for a moment. What passed between Mae and Holt at that specific second was not something that needed or wanted witnesses. The witnesses were just people lucky enough to be in the room when it happened. The wagon ride back to the ranch. The October road, the mesquite on both sides, the way the flat Texas ground went gold in the late morning light. Mae sat beside Holt on the wagon bench and felt the warmth of his arm against hers, and did not think about anything in particular, which was the closest she had come to rest in longer than she could easily calculate. When they came through the ranch gate, Obsidian was at the far end of his corral. He watched the wagon come in, watched it stop, watched Mae step down. And then he walked the full length of the corral at his own pace, unhurried, three-legged, still with only the ghost of the wire injury in his gait, and he put his nose on the top fence rail at the exact spot where she stopped. She put her hand on his muzzle, the broad, warm flat of it, his breath on her palm. Holt came to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder. He put his hand on the fence rail beside her hand, slow and palm down and not reaching, just present, available, leaving the rest to the horse. Obsidian looked at Holt's hand for a moment. Then he took one step forward and put his nose against Holt's knuckles. Brief, definitive, the specific gravity of an animal that has decided. Then he stepped back, turned, and walked to the center of his corral and dropped his head into the October grass. Mae felt the joy of it move through her, clean and uncomplicated, the particular joy of a thing going exactly the right direction for the right reasons, without anyone forcing the outcome. She said, "He'll come all the way to your hand by spring." Holt looked at the horse, then at her. By spring, he agreed. 6 months later, Pearl set a cup of tea on the porch rail. Not coffee. Pearl had been bringing Mae coffee every morning since the third day of her time at the Granger spread, and this morning it was tea, set down without comment and carried back inside without ceremony. Mae stood on the porch of the main house in the pale April light and held the cup in both hands and felt the steam against her face, and thought about what Pearl had not said, and what the tea meant, and why Pearl had set it down and walked away instead of staying. Because Pearl already knew. Pearl always knew. And Pearl was giving Mae the privacy of discovering it for herself, which was the most considerate thing she could have done. Mae put one hand flat against her stomach, not for any outward reason, for the information. Her body had been telling her something for 2 weeks in the language that preceded certainty, the particular tiredness, the morning-specific nausea, the specific different quality of herself that she had been noting and not quite naming, because naming it made it real, and real things could be lost. But Pearl had brought tea. Obsidian moved through the near pasture below the porch in the long, easy stride of a horse that had decided it was safe to move without calculating every step. His coat in the morning light was the color of good dark earth, the kind that had been worked and rested and worked again and knew what it was for. His left foreleg showed only the faintest trace of the wire injury, a slight difference in the way the hair grew back over the scar, visible only to someone who had put their hands there every day for 3 months and knew the terrain of it the way you knew the terrain of any landscape you had attended to with care. The door behind her opened. Holt came out with his coffee and his hat, and the early morning version of himself that she had spent 6 months learning, not softer than the public version, but more fully present, the way a house was more fully itself when the windows were open. He stood beside her at the porch rail and looked at the pasture and the horse and the April morning spreading itself across the flat Texas ground in the unhurried way of a morning that understood it had enough time. She put her hand over his on the rail. He looked at her hand, then at her face. She had been with Holt Granger long enough to understand that he read situations through physical evidence rather than explanation, the angle of a horse's ears, the set of a man's shoulders, the specific quality of a silence. He read her face now with the same accurate attention, and she watched him arrive at the understanding before she said a word. She said, "Pearl brought tea this morning." He was still for a moment. The length of time it took a man to receive something large and understand what receiving it meant. Then he turned and put both his hands on her shoulders, facing her fully, and looked at her with the whole of his attention, the unguarded version, the one she had first seen in a gully at 3 in the morning. and had been seeing more frequently. Ever since, as the wall he'd maintained for 2 years gradually became unnecessary, stone by stone, until the space where it had been was just open ground, he said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. Everything that needed to be known was already between them in the April light on the porch of a house built in increments over 30 years, each addition reflecting what the land had given up that season. Good years and poor years and the years in between, all of it accumulated into a place that was built to last past any one person's lifetime. He pulled her in and held her the way he held things he intended to keep, with the full deliberate weight of a man who had decided, and whose decisions, once made, did not reverse. She put her face against his flannel shirt and listened to his heartbeat, which was steady and unhurried and entirely itself, and she thought about dust. The dust of Odell had tasted like endings when she stepped off the stagecoach in a ruined cream dress with $4 folded into a hem and a stack of letters from a dead man tied with string. She had known that taste, the gritty, back-of-the-throat kind that coated everything and refused to wash out. She had swallowed it for 2,000 miles, and arrived at a town that had already decided what her story was. But the dust of the Granger spread tasted different. Dry grass and creek water, and the particular mineral smell of worked Texas earth. The smell of a place that absorbed everything and gave it back changed. The smell of ground that knew how to hold something. Below the porch, Obsidian raised his head from the grass and looked at the two people on the porch with the calm, fixed attention of a horse that had no current reason to be alarmed, which was the most specific evidence available for how far he had come from the animal, who had thrown 4 men and shattered a corral fence on a Tuesday morning in August. The April light moved across the pasture the way good light moved, without hurrying, touching everything with the same even attention. The fence lines and the barn roof and the farm mesquite and the dark horse standing in the new grass as though he had always been there and always would be. Mae Sutton had arrived in Odell, Texas with 1 trunk, $4, a dead man's broken promise, and a town's worth of closed doors. She had not come looking for this. She had come looking for survival, and had found something the word survival was too small to contain. She had come with nothing, and built something out of patience and precision, and the refusal to be less than she was in a place that had every reason to require it. She had earned each piece of what she had: the stable, the horse, the man, the morning, the April light, the new thing beginning in her that Pearl had understood before she did. The story the town of Odell had decided about her before she stepped off the stagecoach had been wrong about everything except the ending. It had ended in Odell, Texas, just not the way anyone there had thought.